Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about What If Deku Had Wings of Fire Part 1. If you guys enjoy this What If and want to see Part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗧𝗵𝗃_444 from AO3. So let's start the video. This would either be the best or the worst night of Izuku's life. Luckily, he'd had a best-worst night of his life about once a week since he'd been born, so he had a bit of experience with this sort of thing. Izuku stuck his head into the forge, where Aizawa was hunched over a glowing steel sword, wiping impatiently at the rivulets of sweat dripping down his brow. Next to him was a barrel full of dented, misshapen weaponry that Izuku really should have been helping with. "Well, I'm heading out." "Of course you are." Aizawa didn't even look up. For his hammer. "Don't die." "I won't," Izuku chirped back. "I never do. And besides, I've got a good feeling about tonight." As if on cue, the telltale whoosh crackle of fire catching on straw thatching ripped through the forge, even through the closed window. Aizawa raised an eyebrow at him and pointedly nailed his hammer against the sword. Izuku winced. "Finding a new assistant is going to be a pain in my butt." Izuku grinned and hauled his catapult into a wheelbarrow. "I'll be quick, I swear." Yeah. And with that, Izuku flung open the forge door and into the war. Fires blazed. Hordes of screaming sheep and cattle stampeded by. The air rang thick and hot with the familiar clang of metal on talons, metal on teeth. Nearby, Aizawa's stack of hay bales had been set ablaze. Izuku in a breath that tasted of smoke and ash. The dragons had come. And he was going to catch one. Izuku clutched the handle of his wheelbarrow and bolted towards the village. It bounced and jolted and squeaked in complaint as they flew down the hillside, tumbling over rocks and skidding on damp patches of bracken and weeds. Izuku's heart in his throat. He was close enough to hear yelling now, and see the arching shadows of the beasts as they swooped out of range of arrows. With a final heave, Izuku crested the last of the rocky outcrops and all but fell into the chaos below. "Izuku!" A large, calloused hand snatched him out of the air. "What are you doing? Get back inside." Izuku hung limply by the scruff of his neck, like a cat caught in the larder. His wheelbarrow screeched to a halt in the wake of one massive boot. "All Might!" Izuku yelped. "Sorry, I was just..." "You were just sneaking around where you don't belong." All Might bellowed, and Izuku flinched. All Might cleared his throat and set Izuku down gently in the slightly singed heather. All Might was the chief of their tribe on the little Isle of 𝗏𝗏, and his name was one of fear and renown across the uncivilized world. He certainly looked the part, huge, muscled, with a great mane of blonde hair and a beard like a hedgehog struck by lightning, a little creaky in the knees, perhaps after years of plundering and thieving his way across the archipelago, but formidable nonetheless. He also happened to be Izuku's father. They only knew how. All Might cleared this throat again and patted Izuku on the head with such accidental force that he sank a couple of inches into the loamy earth. "Izuku, my boy," All Might said gruffly, "you know as well as I do that it's dangerous to be out here." "Everyone else is out here," Izuku shot back, trying not to sound petulant but mostly failing because really, everyone else was out there. "How am I supposed to catch a dragon if I'm stuck inside all the time?" All Might looked down at him with a vaguely constipated expression. Catching a dragon." He knelt on a knee, chainmail and bulky armor clattering around him. "I know you're anxious to prove yourself, little hero, but you still have lessons to learn. And a little ways to grow." He swept a critical eye over Izuku's narrow shoulders. "The time is not right. Not yet." Izuku held in a sigh. He'd heard those words before, but they never failed to make him feel a little smaller every time. All Might ruffled his hair affectionately. "Hurry along back to the forge. Aizawa will be wondering where you are, no doubt. Best not to worry him." And with that, he was off towards the fires and swooping shapes, axe raised high. Izuku watched his retreating back disappear into plumes of smoke, and then got to work hauling his wheelbarrow out of the squelchy bit of mud it was making a home out of. He loved his dad, he really did, but he could only miss so many fishing trips, or pillages, or dragon fights, or other activities meant for real Vikings before the sting of it started to get to him. And if Izuku had any hope of becoming a real Viking, he first had to catch a dragon. Catch a dragon, and bring its head back to the Great Hall on a pike to hang on the wall next to the snarling skulls of its unfortunate brothers. He tried for years without success. But this time for sure. Dragons and humans had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. Only the especially wise and wrinkly elders of the tribes knew what had started it, but that didn't really matter all that much to the Vikings these days. The dragons stole their food, killed their young, torched their fields, and gutted their buildings. Many had rippling burn marks or missing limbs from a lifetime of fending off the vicious creatures. Even Izuku, who'd usually been ferried away from the worst of the action, had great slashing scars across his arms from an attack on the forge. It was as good of a reason as any to return the attacks in kind. Izuku dragged his little wheelbarrow up a craggy hill and began to unload his secret weapon. A wooden spear thrower, an otlotl he'd fashioned years ago, after rumors passed from fishing boat to fishing boat of the Romans' weapons in the east, much smaller and shakier, of course, and been painstakingly repairing and improving after each failed attempt. Izuku loaded the spear. Crouched behind the trigger, knees wet in the shallow grass. The next shriek of light, dragons scattering. Izuku aimed for a gleaming shadow around a mouthful of sparking explosions, far, far into the distance. Time clicked to a halt. Inhale. Exhale. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. The spear flew out of its hold and whipped into the sky, a line of silver in the watery dark. The recoil kicked Izuku in the seat and sent him tumbling back, but he scrambled to his feet and desperately tracked his gaze after that slick streak, squinting, searching. A scream that made the hairs on the back of Izuku's neck shoot up let him know he'd hit his target. And there it was, the tiny, low swoop of a dragon down towards the woods on the far side of the island. Izuku gaped for a moment, rubbed his eyes. Had that just happened? He checked the spearless spear thrower. Rubbed his eyes again. I did it, he whispered to himself. Quietly at first, and then, I did it. I did it. Izuku crowed, incredulous in the empty air, and threw himself backwards towards the mounds of shrubbery. His heart shuddered in his ear. His face had stretched itself into a smile so large his cheeks ached. Large, effervescent bubbles of happiness rose from the bottoms of his boots to the very tips of his hair. He'd done it. He'd really done it. Izuku imagined himself returning tomorrow morning, just as the sun crested the horizon, holding a dragon's head mounted on a sword high above him so the whole village could see it. He imagined the look of pride on All Might's face. He imagined helping haul the nets up on fishing trips he'd finally be allowed to go on, of questing like the heroes in the bard stories, of finally able to shout out the call of the warriors with his tribesmen. He pressed his hands to his face, mouthing I did it, I did it, I did it, to no one, those welling bubbles inside him and the occasional jittering aftershock of adrenaline pushing tears to the corners of his eyes. Above him, dragons roared and flamed and raged. Eventually, when the dust settled and the last of the winged beasts had disappeared to whatever hole they'd crawled out of, Izuku staggered to his feet and hauled his rattling spear thrower back to the forge. Aizawa still sat in front of the smoking fire pit, hammering dents out of a helmet. He shot Izuku a weary glance at the sound of the heavy door dragging open. Do you still have all your limbs? Yep. Izuku cheerfully stashed his wheelbarrow in a dusty corner, and then, because he couldn't help himself, burst out with, and I shot a dragon. Aizawa's eyebrows climbed to his hairline. Really? Izuku fumbled his scarred fingers together and swallowed. Why, a pretty powerful type, I think. One of the ones with those sparkly, explosive flame blasts. It landed in the woods on the far side of the island. I'm going to go find it in the morning. Aizawa's expression didn't change. Izuku felt himself flush. But Aizawa only heaved a sigh and kicked a bucket full of swords in need of sharpening towards him. Then I suppose you're going to need your sleep. The sooner you finish up with these, the sooner I'll let you go home. Get on with it. Beaming, Izuku did. By the time all the swords were straight-edged and gleaming and Izuku crept back to All Might's chiefly hut at the head of the village, it was nearly midnight. He found All Might collapsed in a chair in front of the fire, snoring like an asthmatic bull. Grinning to himself, Izuku removed the helmet from his head and set it aside. The only sign that All Might had been in battle was the charred hem of the cloak rumpled under his head. Supper was on the table, a rich-smelling stew with a glistening layer of fat on the surface, but Izuku felt too wired to eat much. He made himself grab an apple and a hunk of cheese, though, and chewed on them as he slid into his bedroom and shut the door quietly behind him. It was not yet spring, and icy wind currents ripped across the little Isle of Berk, howling through the wooden panels of Izuku's walls and whistling on, past the island entirely and over the West Ocean and towards, if you were a fantastical sort of person, the imaginary land known as America. Between the cold and the wind and the thudding excitement of catching his own dragon, wow, Izuku only managed a few restless hours of sleep, shivering himself up and out of bed before the sky had even begun to lighten. He was careful not to make any noise as he slid on his warmest tunic, the sealskin boots with the grips on the bottom, and a sword about a foot too long for him that he'd nicked from his bucket at the forge last night. It felt strange and heavy at his waist, and it unbalanced him as he tumbled out of his low window and into the dewy grass. It was still dark, but Izuku could hear the rousing call of cliffside seagulls beginning their morning hunts. He grinned into the misty, whispering air, full to bursting with excitement and anticipation, and started towards the grassy plains. It was a long walk to the woodlands on the far side of the island, some 2.5 hours, but Izuku knew a handy, if not harrowing shortcut through a choppy stretch of sea in one of the island's sweeping bays. Clambering down the ragged cliff and braving the icy waters was a lot harder with a sword, Izuku found. When he finally dragged himself to shore, wet and limp and shuddering at the bite of the wind, Izuku vowed to learn how to fight with a knife, if only so he'd never have a repeat incident of whatever that was. The sky had thinned and paled, and his clothes and hair had stiffened with salt when Izuku finally breached the edge of the woodlands and began his search. It was lovely here in the early morning, the jut of mossy boulders, the clamber of stretching trees, the snarl of roots and logs below nearly completely concealed by fog, and usually Izuku would stop to peer at interesting mushrooms and climb up a few promising-looking branches, but he was on a mission here. A quest. Izuku remembered the dragon falling closer to seaside than inland, so he stuck to the outskirts of the woods, tracing and retracing his steps when he thought he heard a sound, or saw a crush of shrubbery that might have been flattened by something other than the raging wind. He nicked trees with the tip of his sword to mark them. He followed the snaking lines of the bogs to check if the dragon had somehow managed to drag itself towards a water source. The sun had heaved half its glorious head over the horizon, then the other half lifting the veil of damp fog with it. Izuku searched and searched and searched. Not a hide nor a hair of the elusive creature. He was sure he'd shot it down. He'd seen it isting into the woods like a comet, no mistake. Izuku tugged on the roots of his hair with frustration and twisted on his heels. The answer to all his problems was right there, somewhere in these God's-forsaken woods, so why couldn't he find it? Honestly, it was just his luck something like this would happen. Finally shoot himself a dragon only for it to be swallowed by the boggy swamps of the island like a juicy fillet of herring. That seemed like the sort of cosmic irony Izuku was used to dealing with. In his pacing, Izuku had happened upon a particularly damp and slippery stretch of mossy rock. With a muffled yelp, Izuku felt his ankle buckled meanly, and suddenly the ground gave way into a slick, grassy line that he tumbled down over and over himself, a pebble spinning down a cliff straight into the loom of a massive boulder that he met with the crown of his head. Izuku groaned and sat up, rubbing what was sure to grow into a sizable lump. His sword cut fiercely into his side, and his ankle throbbed, hot to the touch. It took him a moment to blink away the fuzzies from his eyes. Below him, just over the lip of the boulder, was a wobbly circle basin indented some several meters into the forest floor, about the size of a largish field. Tree roots dripped over its rocky walls. A glassy lake, a pond really, hugged the far edge. It looked like a giant, or maybe the great god Thor himself, had lowered a mighty boot and impressed a footprint into the earth. Izuku was so busy marveling at the natural phenomenon, musing over whether the lake might be fed by some underground water supply since it was so free of algae, that he almost missed the curled black shape far below him. Almost. With a gasp he just managed to catch in his hand, Izuku ducked behind the boulder. The dragon! The dragon! Long and sinewy, and caught in the spill of some overhanging roots like a spider dangling from a web. Izuku snuck another peek. It really was a magnificent creature. Strong, spiny wings and tail, shifting muscle, hazy scales that swallowed the light in great, black gulps fading to a pale underbelly twisting towards the morning sky. Izuku could just see the stripe of his spear buried under the joint of one massive shoulder. He couldn't tell if the dragon was breathing, but he was pretty sure those eyes were closed. Some deep-rooted survival instinct stirred in the pit of his stomach. Run, it urged, run, run from this creature, this evil creature, this one is of dark and crawling places. Run, run, run. But Izuku was not in the habit of running from anything. He ducked back away and clenched his fingers around the hilt of his sword. His heart beat a tattoo against his ribcage. Come on, Izuku. You can do this. Shaking faintly, but nerves steeled, Izuku flattened himself against the boulder and began to worm his way down the jagged drop. It was incredibly slow-going. Most of his footholds were slick with lichen, and he was half afraid that the roots he was clinging on to would snap under his weight. Each time he dislodged a cascade of pebbles, or his sword clattered loudly in its scabbard, Izuku bit the inside of his cheek and prayed that the dragon didn't wake up. And by the time he'd edged into the clearing, it seemed like luck might be on Izuku's side. And then the wind changed. With a curl of fear that sent the hairs on the back of Izuku's neck straight up, the dragon's nose twitched once, twice, and its feline eyes snapped open. Something was happening in the ocean. Far below where the sunlight could reach, under fathom upon fathom of icy water, a current began to stir, as if roused from an ageless sleep. Like a languid ghost, it drifted through skeletons of forgotten reefs, between the rocky arches of caves, and over vast, underwater mountains. Kilometers from where it started, the current wrapped around a shape so encrusted with barnacles and algae that it might have been a part of the ocean floor itself. Gently, carefully, it lifted the shape from its place and towards lighter waters, a cape of kelp trailing behind. Gently, carefully, it nudged it onto the shore of a tiny island. With a last kiss to its proud feet, the tide hissed over the sand and slunk away, leaving the shape facing towards the distant horizon, as if waiting for something. Or, if you're a fantastical sort of person, perhaps someone. An ugly, ancient 𝗔𝗪𝙢 reared its head in Izuku's esteem. His body knew this game, and his awareness narrowed to thump of his heartbeat in his hearts, the rush of his breath, the throb of pain in his ankle. The dragon was half a head above him, strung in ropes of roots the size of his forearm, one wing crooked and bent at its back, and still bleeding sluggishly where the spear bristled from its side. It was immobile, wounded, and Izuku had a sword. But that didn't matter. The moment those red eyes met his, Izuku knew what he was. A low, ominous humming sound, shivering from the dragon's reptilian throat, shook the ground beneath Izuku's feet. He swallowed hard. One arc of his arm stood between Izuku and everything he'd ever wanted. This was his chance to be a hero. Everyone else Izuku's age had stretched and broadened like tree trunks over the last few summers, and they'd all caught their dragons. He'd attended every single one of their initiation ceremonies, trying not to feel sick with jealousy because that would horrible and selfish, but he'd always been small and scrappy, wiry and untidy looking, like a stray dog, no matter how much he ate or trained. His sword fighting skills were nothing to write home about, and he was short enough that he was able to sink into the background of any crowd. Or he would have been able to, if not for All Might. Izuku wasn't stupid. He'd heard the whispers. He's awfully small, isn't he? How old did you say he was? That kid. Really? He's supposed to be the next chief of the hooligan tribe. And worst of all, I feel real sorry for All Might, the greatest hero stuck with a son like that. He had to catch this dragon. He had to. All Might. His mother. The tribe. That was the mantra Izuku repeated to himself as he crept forward, forcing one foot in front of the other. Those red eyes tracked him like homing beacons, and the humming noise darkened, threatening. Izuku made it about 2 sword lengths away before the dragon moved. With an unholy scream of fury, It shoved itself away from the cliff face at its back and flung sparkling ball of fire in all directions. Izuku just managed to roll himself out of the way, mouth and nose thick with the sulphurous smell of burning hair, ankle shrieking in protest. He flattened himself to the ground as fire rained down, face pressed into the cool dirt. The dragon twisted and writhed in its prison of roots, coughing great volleys of heat that made swaths of dirt around them glow like coals. The boulder Izuku was hiding behind oozed and melted at the edges. He should have expected that. Izuku forced himself not to panic, obsessively cataloging the time between the dragon's blasts, between the quick of his breath and the clench of his fingers around the hilt of his sword. His mind whirred. If he wanted to, he was fast enough that he could scramble up the rocky walls and shield himself behind outcrops during waves of dragon fire like some sick game of red light green light, but Izuku rejected the thought as quickly as it had come. The sword he had with him was made for someone twice his height, too long and cumbersome for any sort of real battle, on top of the fact that Izuku was about as good at sword fighting as he was at 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗏. Which was to say, not very. The dragon was much larger and stronger than he was, not to mention that strange, exploding fire that looked hot enough to flay Izuku's skin from his bones. And then an idea dawned on him. A crazy, stupid, possibly suicidal idea. Surreptitiously, Izuku ducked his head over the boulder to assess the mess of roots still suspending the dragon above the ground. Yes, with a lot of luck and a helpful nudge from the great god Thor, this could work. He waited until there was a break between the flames, then leapt over the boulder, sword arm extended. Izuku sprinted for the dragon's blind spot beside its sensitive underbelly and swung with all his might at one of the thick roots wrapped around a muscly back leg. The root broke with a snap, and the ball of snarling, furious dragon crashed into the earth beneath, still almost entirely bound. Izuku sent a prayer skyward, and then leaped for the remains of the cut root, ignoring the screech of his ankle. He only just caught it. Before the dragon could twist around and turn him into a human torch, Izuku used the leverage of the root to launch himself onto the dragon's back and stamped a boot into its broken wing. The dragon howled and bucked and spat fire, one molten eye livid with blistering vitriol where it glared up at high. But Izuku bore down on his foot and slid his sword under the scales on its neck and against the thin skin beneath. The dragon froze. Izuku froze too, free hand still clutching onto the cord of root. I'm going to kill you, I'm going to cut off your head and bring it to my father. I'm going to be a hero, just like him. The dragon didn't move a muscle. This close, it looked death and beauty, like something that had crawled out of a god's nightmare. Izuku noticed almost hysterically that the lip of every scale was tipped in a gorgeous, dusky orange. His hand shook as he pressed hard enough for a rivulet of blood to slip down his blade. Something was pulling beneath his skin, 1,000 taut threads. The muscles in his forearm quivered. There was no fear in the dragon's eye, red as the dawn. Izuku could have sworn it was almost challenging, actually, in the mean slant of its brow. Izuku pressed a little harder. 1,000 strings, poised to snap. Izuku dropped his sword. He couldn't. Of course he couldn't. Maybe he'd known that, even yesterday, as he shot this glorious creature out of its perch in the sky, but Izuku couldn't kill anything. What had he been thinking? He had trouble boiling the lobsters the men bought back from their fishing trips. He was weak. Hot, bitter shame welled in his throat, in the backs of his eyelids, as Izuku let go of the root and joined his sword in the dirt. Above, the sun climbed to a peak in the sky. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, dripping tears into the collar of his tunic, but the dragon remained still and silent at his side. You should probably eat me now, Izuku told it morosely. It would save both of us a lot of trouble. The dragon regarded him with unnerving intelligence. Not a lick of fire in sight. He was holding his wing tight to his back, and the spear wound in his side had wet the earth below it with jewel-bright blood. I'm sorry, Izuku pulled at his fingers. I've gone and gotten you horribly injured for nothing. You don't deserve this. You were probably just trying to steal one of our sheep for a meal or something. He reached for his sword. The dragon didn't even twitch. Not even worth barbecuing me anymore, huh? Izuku bitterly scuffed his shoe through grass crisp black, but it's not all bad I suppose. At least Aizawa won't have to go looking for a new assistant. The dragon huffed. Izuku imagined it was amused. Yeah, I'm the joke of the century. Don't gloat. He sighed and made his way to his feet. If you are going to barbecue me, you probably should do it after I sort this out for you. And Izuku began sawing his way through the net of roots. Unless the spear had punctured something vital, it would probably be fine. Maybe it wouldn't even scar. Izuku had no idea how superficial healing worked in animals with scales. He was half prepared to be bitten in half the moment he was finished, but even freed, the dragon didn't move. In fact, its eyes had slitted closed. Izuku ran a critical eye over the damage. It seemed cruel to leave the creature there, but Izuku had seen dragons rip themselves out of barbed nets with nothing but their teeth, or fly away with axes still buried in their necks. A spear in the side was nothing. If not for those tree roots, the dragon most likely would have cleared out of the forest the moment it hit the ground. Well, I'll be going then. With one last glance, Izuku hobbled awkwardly over to the pile of boulders he'd entered from. Climbing them was hard, but not impossible, and all too soon he'd crested the lip of the basin, and the dragon was out of sight. At the top, he gave himself 30 seconds to mourn the life he could have had. He imagined the quests he could have taken, places he could have discovered, the pride he could have basked in, summer warm and golden, and then he set off back the way he came. What with the injured ankle, the sun had long before disappeared into the ocean by the time Izuku, shivering in cold blowing in from an incoming storm, spotted the cheerfully glowing fires of the village. He avoided All Might, Aizawa, his mother, everyone really, as he crawled through his bedroom window and tumbled into his furs, foregoing dinner entirely. Outside, thunderclouds knocked against each other. Berk was the kind of place that was always some variation of wet, what with the rain pouring down constantly from above, and the sea wandering up from below, pockmarking the areas that weren't covered in trees with salty, muddy bogs. The concept of dry clothes was a foreign one. Most days, Izuku would hang up his sodden tunic in front of the fire before going to bed at night, and in the morning it would be warm and wet rather than cold and wet, but wet nonetheless. That uncomfortable feeling still twinged through him, like someone was plucking a harp under his skin. He couldn't get the image of those burning red eyes out of his head. Just before he dropped off to sleep, Izuku remembered something of vital importance. The dragon had a broken wing. Izuku didn't know if it could fly. His eyes popped open. It was probably fine. The dragon could claw its way out of the basin, maybe, hopefully, and call for its friends or something. Or maybe it was one of those digging-type dragons and it could just burrow its way out. And what kind of Viking lay awake worrying about a dragon they shot down, anyway? All Might certainly wouldn't. Then again, All Might would have separated the creature's head from its body the moment he saw it. Izuku rolled over to his other side and shoved his face into the furs as the rain its fists against the wooden roof. But what if the dragon couldn't claw or burrow its way out? What if it had to wait until its wing healed to be able to fly out of there? And Thor knew how long that would take. Maybe Izuku had doomed it to death by starvation, which was far crueler and more horrible than death by sword. Izuku rolled over again. It was raining tonight too, and Izuku couldn't remember there being a shelter large enough in that basin to house a creature that size. It would made the rocks slippery, surely too slippery for sharp talons to grip onto. The strings under his skin jangled, edges frayed. Maybe he'd go back tomorrow. Just to check. No harm in that, right? So much harm in that, the voice of reason Izuku usually listened to screeched at the back of his head. So much harm in that. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut and ignored it. He woke in the morning with a throbbing ankle and a headache, feeling like he'd barely slept a wink. A creeping sensation of dread had made itself a home in his He had a really bad feeling about that dragon's injuries. Maybe he'd take some supplies with him. Just in case. His voice of reason kicked and screamed in protest. His mother was already up and stirring a pot of porridge over the fire when Izuku hurried into the kitchen. She smiled at him. "Morning, Izuku dear." She ladled him a bowlful. "Morning, Mum," he replied, dropping a quick kiss into her hair and taking the bowl. "How did you sleep?" Not bad, oh, morning, sweetheart." All Might stomped into the room and clapped Izuku on the shoulder. "Morning. Inko, you've made porridge." Excellent, excellent. He didn't even bother with a bowl. He took the pot straight out of the fire and to the table where he drank from the rim, smacking his lips. Inko smiled fondly. Delicious. All Might boomed when he'd finished. Many thanks, Inko. 𝗧𝗵𝗵𝗲, you really should be having more to eat than that titchy little bowl, growing man like you. Izuku obediently picked a piece of dried mackerel from the plate in the middle of the table and began to chew on it. All Might grinned at him, mustache full of oats. After he'd finished breakfast, Izuku stopped by Aizawa's forge. The man was already up, grumbling at his soggy firewood. Good morning, Izuku stuttered. Aizawa before noon was a foul-tempered beast. He harumphed and took a vengeful slurp from his mug. Problem child. I can't work today. Sorry. Aizawa eyed him for half a second, and then went back to poking at the wood. Fine. Don't die. I didn't even tell you what I'll be doing. Izuku spluttered, but Aizawa didn't appear to be listening. He didn't ask about the dragon, and Izuku didn't mention it. Knowing Aizawa, he'd probably forgotten. Pausing only to say good morning to the newest baby goat Izuku had affectionately named Lady, he left Aizawa and rushed past the docks, took a left at the Great Hall, and rapped impatient knuckles against a familiar, worn wooden door belonging to a cottage on the edge of the village. On the third knock, it opened to a very small, wrinkled woman with enormous masses of graying hair fastened in a knob at the top of her head. Her face lifted at the sight of him. Izuku. Come in, she clucked and ushered him inside. A warm mug of tea and a plate of honey cakes practically materialized on the table in front of him. Hey Auntie Chio, he grinned, despite himself, and wrapped his hands gratefully around the tea. She tut-tutted, waggling a bony finger at him as she stuffed a fat pipe between her wrinkled lips. None of that, young man. How many times do I have to tell you? That's Grandma Chio to you. She puffed a ring of bluish smoke into his face. Now, what kind of mess have you gotten yourself into this time? Any injuries? Well, Izuku hadn't come here for that, but some treatment would be nice. Especially if he was planning to walk across the island again today. Grandma Chio was the tribe's unofficial doctor and pharmacist, but recently she'd been trying her hand at soothsaying, mostly unsuccessfully. Looking into the future was a complicated business. She was also not Izuku's grandmother. My ankle. Izuku propped it up on chair for her inspection. I tripped. Yesterday. Grandma Chio was already rolling up his breathe leg. And why didn't you come to me yesterday then? Izuku occupied his mouth with a bite of honey cake and a gulp of scorching tea. Grandma Chio leveled him with a disapproving look and slapped some sort of tingly paste on his skin with extreme prejudice. Izuku winced, and then sighed as the thump of pain in his ankle cooled and lessened. Just a sprain, she said, puffing smoke. I tell you to stay off it for a day, but you won't listen to me. Sorry, Izuku said into the rim of his cup, because she was right, of course. Stay here, I'm just going to fetch some bandages, and she disappeared into a far corner. Izuku busied himself with the honey cakes. You must come over sometime later this week, Grandma Chio was saying. I've grown something rather unusual in my garden. You'd find it interesting, I'm sure. Might be some variety of citrus, but it's bright purple, which is a treat. I was thinking of making it into tea, as long as I don't have to try it, Izuku replied doubtfully. More often than not, the test subjects of Grandma Chio's botanical creations ended up with hives, upset stomachs, and other equally unpleasant ailments. Of course not, she placated, which really didn't fill Izuku with confidence. It was what she said every time. Now where did I She set down a basket of bandages almost as big as she was at the foot of the table and began to bind Izuku's ankle. Well, now or never, he supposed. Grandma. Yes, dear. From a purely theoretical point of view, how would you go about healing, say, a stab wound? And a broken arm? She fixed him with a squintus stare, beady eyes bright with suspicion as she chewed on the end of her pipe. Izuku fidgeted in his chair. Hypothetically, she wrapped a length of bandage around his foot particularly viciously. Why would I need to be healing a stab wound or a broken arm, Izuku? Anything you'd like to share? Izuku wilted guiltily over the table. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 tucked a hand under his chin and forced him to meet her gaze. There was a long moment, and then her face opened like a clamshell. "Oh," she murmured at whatever she saw there, "I knew the entrails were undeniable. In that case, I best get you sorted out then," and she bustled around the table. 𝗵𝗃𝗃's cottage was one of Izuku's favorite places on the island. It was only one room, but it always seemed so much larger on the inside. Shelves thick with jars and bottles and glinting pebbles and bird bones and other interesting trinkets swallowed up the far wall. Strings of dried garlic and chilies and various herbs hung like vines from the rafters. It always smelled earthy and woodsy and a little sweet, especially if 𝗵𝗃𝗃 had something going in her cauldron over the fire. Miraculously, there was not a speck of dust or dirt anywhere, nor was there a bed. No one had any idea where 𝗵𝗃𝗃 slept, and no one had been brave enough to ask her either. "Right?" she fussed, setting a row of items out on the table and tossing her pipe somewhere over her shoulder. "This is what you're going to need. Listen very carefully, I won't repeat myself. That," she pointed at a corked vial full of clear liquid, "is to keep out infection. A healthy dose of it will clean just about anything. Those ones are to keep everything dry," she pointed at a roll of thick bandages, "and those ones are to keep everything in place. Blue is for pain, red is for fever. Don't overdo it, a spoon and a half should be plenty." She tapped 2 smaller jars and tightened the twine on a bundle of dried leaves, "and make sure to tuck these into the bandages." Izuku nodded frantically, desperately trying to commit everything to memory. "Thank you so much. And what about the broken arm?" 𝗵𝗃𝗃 crossed her arms. "Splint it well," she said, firmly, "and secure it. Broken bones are fiddly things." She swept everything into a burlap satchel and moved it into Izuku's hands. "Off you go then, quick, nobody's getting any younger around here." Izuku stuttered his thanks again and bowed so low he almost brained himself on the table. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 ushered him out with one last kiss to his cheek and snapped the door shut behind him. Izuku slung the satchel over his shoulder, drew a breath, and set off. Half of him was still arguing that this was an absolutely pointless endeavor, and there would be nothing but claw marks waiting for him in the basin. The other half of him was vibrating with anxiety. He couldn't revisit his little shortcut through the gully, not with a bag full of precious supplies, so it was well past midday by the time he reached the little clearing. The forest had been silent for miles, which didn't help the dread that had now deepened and pooled in his stomach. The reason for the lack of wildlife quickly became apparent. Far below, the dragon was one long line of black beside the bank of the little lake. Izuku was 2 parts sick with anxiety, 1 part grimly satisfied. It wasn't often that his instincts were wrong. The dragon's eyes were still open, and miraculously it didn't turn Izuku into a matchstick as it followed his approach down the pile of boulders. It did, however, scorch a warning line into the bank in front of it. The thrill of fear that sang through him was strong enough that Izuku considered just turning around and forgetting this ever happened, but the broken jut of the dragon's right wing where the left sat so lean and straight pressed hot prongs of guilt into his back and nudged him forward. "Hello," Izuku began hesitantly, feeling like an idiot. I come in peace?" The dragon huffed an unimpressed burst of smoke from its nostrils. Izuku tried not to flinch. "I really am super sorry," he continued, "but I think I can help with that wing. And the spear." "Sorry again." He reached forwards to the side the dragon had curled around, the side with the spear still stuck in it, but the dragon snapped its teeth shut on the air where Izuku's hand had been seconds before. He sighed. "You probably don't have a glowing opinion of me so far." He tried to smile ruefully, "but maybe this will help." He rooted around on the ground for a moment, looking for an appropriately sized stick. Izuku lifted the hem of his tunic and mimed stabbing the stick into his side. If a dragon had ever looked skeptical, it was this one. I really am sorry about that, but pretend this is the spear. All I have to do is just..." He fished a short knife out of his satchel and mimed swiping it across the skin of his ribcage. "Right? And then I'll pull it out as gently as I can, but it'll probably hurt." He pulled the stick out of his side, "and then clean it some. Should be good as new." He held the stick up for the dragon's inspection, feeling foolish. It snuffled at it for a second, and then uncurled itself slowly, like an approaching storm. Izuku couldn't believe his eyes. There's no way that worked, he mumbled ecstatically to himself as he padded around to the dragon's other side. No way, I'll have to tell. He stopped short at the sight of the wound. It was bad might have been an understatement. The flesh around the head of the spear looked painfully swollen, shiny and taut under the scales. A congealed ring of muck and mucus had crusted around the opening. And the smell? Izuku almost had to hold his nose. Sweet and putrid, like rotting fruit. Okay, he muttered to himself, okay, this is fine. You can fix this. Swallowing his bile, Izuku knelt down. He'd watched 𝗵𝗃 work nearly all his life. Surely that had to count for something. At the first touch of his hand on the spear, the dragon thrashed away and spat a furious explosion into the empty air. Izuku ran a hand down its scaly side. I'm sorry, he murmured, feeling that hot guilt press and surge. Sorry, try to hold still. I'm so sorry. With a piece of flint Izuku kept in his boot, he shot a few sparks towards onto a length of one of the bandages he'd brought and ran the knife briefly through the fire to clean it. He kicked it away towards the damp river weeds. The angry red skin parted like a split fig at one pass of the long side of the blade. The dragon lowly in the back of its throat. Sorry, Izuku kept whispering, a near-constant stream. Sorry, let me just. He dislodged the spear with a horrible squelch. The dragon's answering scream sent tears to Izuku's eyes. Still crying, he pressed his hands gently to either side of the wound and nearly gagged as it began to drain pus and old 𝗬𝗲𝗍𝗪𝗐. But however bad it was for Izuku, it must have been 1,000,000 times worse for the dragon. The great beast thrashed its great tail once, twice, and then lay still. Out cold. Izuku couldn't help feeling like it was a mercy. As the yellowing puddle at Izuku's feet grew, the swelling gradually lessened. It would have been a good thing if it didn't reveal ugly sections of dark purple beneath it, necrosis. Under the rising nausea, Izuku found himself wondering how on earth the wound had gotten this bad in a little over a day. He cut away the festering flesh as cleanly as he could, and then rinsed the whole thing in 𝗵𝗃𝗃's miracle cleaning liquid, covering it with dried herbs and plenty of springy, absorbent moss. It was a little hard to wrap anything around a dragon that was mostly plastered to the floor, but Izuku thought he managed it pretty well, all things considering. He fixed the last of the bandages in place and stepped back, hands on his hips. Izuku was a little proud of himself. But now onto the wing. The shards of bone clattered and ground against each other as Izuku arranged them as best as he could in a shaky line. He fastened each section to its own wooden splint with rope woven from lengths of flexible reeds and folded the whole thing up like a fan. After a second's hesitation, he bound it as tightly as he could to the dragon's back, remembering 𝗵𝗃𝗃's advice. The whole ordeal took a little over an hour, and Izuku was more than a little hungry when he finished. It reminded him that the dragon probably hadn't had anything to eat since yesterday. Spear in hand, he wandered over to the lake. Half an hour later, Izuku had caught enough fish to feed himself and the dragon about 3 times over. There was enough low-growing shrubbery around the clearing that he had a roaring fire going in no time. The smell of roasting fish was the thing that finally woke the dragon. Sleep well? Izuku asked politely, and then nudged the dragon's pile of fish forwards. It cast Izuku a suspicious look. Don't give me that, Izuku admonished, it's fresh from the lake. The dragon glared at him for a second longer before its hunger apparently won out and it began to scarf down its fish. There was a moment of relative peace as Izuku picked the last of the meat from the bones of his herring, and the dragon polished off the pile. It occurred to Izuku that, like this, the dragon wasn't going to be able to feed itself. He'd have to come back for that, probably every day. The thought didn't disturb him as much as it should have, even though it was so at odds with almost everything Izuku had been told his whole life. The Vikings were at war with the dragons. But Izuku had never really been a proper Viking anyway. Izuku made sure to fill the satchel to bursting with the wild herbs 𝗵𝗃𝗃 liked to use in her medicines on his way back and drop it off at her cottage as a thank you. She'd smiled knowingly at him and patted a wizened hand against his cheek. Sleep came eventually, and at first light the next morning Izuku strapped his spear to his back and set off into the heather-blown hills at the base of the woodlands. It was drizzling, a warm rain today over the bright smudge of the sun, and Izuku found himself almost looking forward to seeing the dragon. If nothing else, a flaming beast quite literally falling out of the sky and into his life was a break from the monotony that seemed to wrap around Berk like a shroud. Nothing ever really changed here. Fishing trips, raids, feuds with other tribes that flared and then fizzled within a few months, cycling over and over with the seasons. Even if Izuku had been able to tag along, a life like that got tedious after a while. It was half of the reason he was so desperate to be a hero. He wanted to quest, to discover new lands, sail all the way to the west to check if the world really was as flat as a pancake, live in a little boat under nothing but a carpet of stars. He wanted to be the kind of hero the bards would sing about, regaling his trickeries and battles to rapt audiences. A distant dream. The storm from yesterday had turned large swaths of the ground to mush, and Izuku found himself wading through waist-high gorse and bracken when he wasn't sliding on boulders polished smooth by the raging winds. Izuku was getting very good at navigating through the forest now, cataloging fallen logs, the occasional narrow stream, and other distinct features that stuck out like little pins on a map to help him find his way. He took the shortcut through the gulf, paddling against the current chewing at his sides, and scrambling up the opposite crag of rock like a bedraggled spider before a wave could sweep him away, pull him out to sea. He was still mostly damp by the time he made it to the basin, and he was so focused on keeping his tenuous foothold on his way down that it took him a while to realize that familiar black shape of the dragon was nowhere to be found. Instead, a little way from where the beast had last been laying by the riverbank was a blond boy snoozing peacefully in the grass. There was still a pile of fish bones in the mud. There was no way the dragon could have gotten out on its own. The boy must have anger. Pure, white-hot anger like Izuku had never known smacked him abruptly over the head and forced him forwards before he'd even decided to move. In seconds, Izuku had drawn the short knife he'd kept on him from yesterday and stuck the point of it into the underside of the sleeping boy's chin. His eyes flew open. "Who are you?" Izuku hissed, practically trembling with fury. "And what did you do to the dragon?" The boy's mouth fell open. How the F are you talking to me right now?" Which was not what Izuku had been expecting. He stared. "Pardon?" The boy struggled to sit up. "I thought I was in hallucinating those other times, but you really... Who taught you? Was it one of us? I'll kill them." Izuku blinked, and then shoved a knee into the boy's tea. "I don't know what you're talking about," he seethed, "and I don't care. Where's the dragon? Get off me. Tell me what you did to the dragon." If this boy who Izuku had never seen before in his life, had touched even a scale on the dragon's back, Izuku would chuck him in the ocean. "I didn't do anything to that demon dragon. Let me up." A blot of crimson had begun to bloom in whatever weird lengths of fabric Izuku just noticed were tied around the boy's waist. He fought off the urge to leap off and ask if everything was okay. He pressed the knife in a little harder. "Where? The dragon?" The boy glared up at him. "Get that shitty iron away from my effin' face and maybe I'll tell you." Izuku paused, and with a frustrated huff of breath, he tossed the knife somewhere towards the lake, even though fiber of his being was screaming at him not to. "Now," he said through gritted teeth, "fess up. Where is the dragon?" The boy bared his own teeth. "Right here." Izuku wondered if he'd heard that correctly. "Here. That's what I effin' said. Are you slow or something?" He was glowering up at Izuku with a familiar look of challenge in those blazing red eyes. Izuku did a cursory sweep of the clearing. "Where exactly is here?" The boy shoved Izuku's knee off his tea, sending him crashing sideways, and tried unsuccessfully to prop himself up on his elbows, groaning in what might have been pain. Izuku didn't care. With one wrench of his arm, Izuku pulled the spear off his back, a bit unbalanced under the weight, and knocked the blunt end against the boy's temple. He watched as the boy grunted in surprise and backwards, looking dazed for a second, and then lifted a fist to retaliate. Izuku didn't let it get that far. Channeling the embers of his anger, Izuku threw all his weight into one arm and barred it across the boy's shoulders to shove him down, and with the other, sunk the spear into the dirt beside his head. The boy cried out in pain. "Talk?" he ground out. "I'm not kidding." Izuku tightened his grip, nails digging in, just to show how not kidding he really was. You wouldn't. The boy's eyes were wide with surprise and contempt. In answer, Izuku yanked the spear out of the dirt and hefted it over his own shoulder, point angled into the boy's. Try me. He watched in real time as what looked like a conflict of epic proportions played across the boy's face. Fine. You better not effing stab me. Izuku had a moment to puzzle what on earth he'd meant by that before something began happening to the boy's skin. Writhing and bubbling. The jut and slither of shapes, a horrible sort of moving under there, a creature struggling to get out. Izuku scrambled back. With an awful crunching, popping noise, like stepping on a dried skeleton, the shapes broke free and fanned out, skin smoothing into black scales, shoulder blades rising into long protrusions, the boy's sharp face growing and lengthening until Izuku's spear fell from his fingers. A dragon crouched on its hind legs before him, big enough to block out the sun. A familiar dragon, with spiny wings and orange-tipped scales, and blazing red eyes. With another crunch, the dragon collapsed like origami back into the form of a blond boy, about Izuku's age, swaddled in bandages and swaying on unsteady feet. But those eyes were the same. Izuku, like any Viking, was intimately familiar with dragons, little ones the size of his fingernail hopping through the heather. Dragons the size of ancient trees wreaking havoc on his village nearly every night. Huge beasts many times the size of the big blue whale slumbering in the depths of the ocean, whose snores sent tidal waves swamping the shores of the archipelago from half a world away. But never in all his life had Izuku seen or heard of a dragon that could turn into a boy. Especially not one that looked like that. Izuku gaped. Feet frozen. Mind whirring. Pinched himself hard just to check. Sharp pain, not a dream. The boy coughed wetly, curling around his injured side. Now F off. Izuku started forwards, arms outstretched. I can rewrap that for you, he murmured, struggling to reconcile the human in pain in front of him with the snarling beast of the dragon he'd had under his sword not 2 days ago. Here, let me, I said F off. But you'll bleed out. Don't effin' touch me. The boy spat a hateful glob of spit onto the ground between them. Dragon killer. Izuku flinched badly. It hadn't really hit him until he'd had a sword at its throat a couple of days ago that killing a dragon meant killing a dragon, a proud, independent beast that had felt closer to a human than an animal, even yesterday. The guilt stung his eyes. Please, I can help, he tried. What? Now I look like one of yours, you're gonna effin' apologize. I swear to whatever gods you believe in that I'll torch you if you come any closer, the boy sneered, voice so angry it was like little wounds all over Izuku's skin. I don't need your help. I don't want your help. This is your effin' fault in the first place and you know it. There was that singing in his veins again, a twang and quiver, but there was such hate on the boy's face. Izuku swallowed hard and spoke one more time, voice trembling. If I don't help you, you'll die. Those eyes were 2 chips of red ice. I hate you and your kind. Death by nature's hands would be a mercy. The words sank into Izuku's skin and forced his feet around. Numbly, he climbed the tumble of boulders, over the lip of the basin. Izuku felt the boy's gaze on the back of his neck until the basin vanished behind the treeline. As if in a dream, Izuku swam the gully and stumbled back towards the village, wet clothes chafing against his skin. He registered none of it, distracted by the flashing on the backs of his eyelids and the crunch of bones stretching into wings. Izuku could swear he heard in between each rustle of the forest. By some miracle, he found himself outside Grandma Chiyo's cottage. She opened the door before he'd even had a chance to knock, not looking the least bit surprised. The drag of Izuku's breath had become difficult in his throat, like he'd been running. Panic, thick and cold, coursed through him. His brain felt fuzzy. He pressed his hands to his eye sockets, hard, trying to force away the afterimage of the angry boy with blood seeping from his stomach, the dragon blotting out the sun. Izuku, someone said, and that was him, wasn't it? Izuku. Dragon killer. Almost dragon killer. Person killer. Boy with red eyes killer. His heartbeat stumbled. His CC rose and fell, quickly, so why did it feel like there wasn't enough oxygen left in the world? He put his head in his hands and gasped. Dragon killer, killer, killer. Izuku's perception of things came back to him in fragments. The chair at his back. The whirls in the wooden grain of the tabletop. A towel around his shoulders. He blinked and blinked, trying to focus his eyes. There was a mug of tea in front of him, with leaves floating at the bottom. Leaves and one yellow flower. Drink, someone was saying, and that was Aunt 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏. Those were her fingers around the handle of the mug, forcing it into his grip. He took a sip, still shuddering with the aftershocks. The tea was hot and bitter and bracing. The tightness in his teeth eased a little. "Thank you," he managed, voice hoarse. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 clicked her tongue. "Don't thank me. Are you all right?" Izuku rubbed a hand over his tea and didn't answer. There was an ache there. What was that? 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 sighed. "Nothing anyone of your time would understand. Not yet anyway. Drink your tea." Izuku obediently took another sip. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 fixed him with a pointed look until he took another, and then another, and finally drained the cup. She refilled it without a word, this time with a spoonful of honey. As Izuku drank his second cup of tea, letting it leach warmth back into his limbs, he wondered if he should tell 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 about the boy. Dragon. Oi dragon. She might believe him. Then again she might not. Izuku could hardly believe it himself, and he was the one who'd seen it. "Izuku," 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 said suddenly, "when was the last time I read your fortune for you? I thought you said you read my fortune all the time." Yes. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 said impatiently, "but not with you in here. It changes the whole thing." Izuku frowned, doubtful. Soothsaying had always seemed a little batty to him. He opened his mouth to reply, but 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 slapped her hands against the table with a brisk, "Well, no time like the present," and rose to her feet. Izuku watched as she then began collecting items from around the room, a handful of animal bones, a few gray pebbles, tiny white peppercorns, the feathery top of a carrot, and bundling them into a handkerchief. "Hand it over," she snapped her fingers under his nose. Izuku plucked a hair from the crown of his head and added it to the handkerchief. He'd seen 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 carry out this process many times before. She tied the corners of the handkerchief together with a length of twine and tossed the whole thing in the fire. Izuku sat in silence as it crackled and popped for a couple of seconds, and then 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 fished it out with the end of her poker. Right? She untied the bundle and emptied the contents onto the table. The bones were blackened and cracked, and all the plant matter had disintegrated. The ash tickled the inside of Izuku's nose. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 studied the table and was quiet for a long time. Just when Izuku was beginning to fidget, 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 wordlessly swept everything into a nearby basket. "You know, I can't say I'm surprised," she said, sounding suspiciously cheerful. "Fate is always whispering about you, pesky, meddling thing that she is." "What did you see?" Izuku was curious despite himself. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 looked aghast. "Well, I can't tell you that." "Why not?" "Because then it won't happen." Izuku thunked his forehead against the table. He'd given up trying to understand 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 a long time ago. A wrinkled hand sat atop his head. "What I can tell you is some advice that may come in useful." 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗏 cleared her throat, and suddenly she sounded much older. "Things generally sort themselves out when people follow their hearts and do what is right." And then she hurried away to refill his teacup. Follow your heart and do what is right. Izuku pondered those words as he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. Follow your heart and do what is right. It was the vaguest, most wishy-washy set of instructions he had ever heard. Follow his heart. Where exactly? If the last couple of days had been any indication, Izuku's heart hadn't the foggiest clue where it was going. And do what is right might have been even worse. Was he right to have shot down that dragon? That stinging pressure under his skin was screaming no as loud as it could, but every other member of the hooligan tribe, no, every Viking in the archipelago would answer yes, 1,000 times yes. He repeated the phrase over and over to himself until it didn't sound real. Next to it, reverberating around his skull like a bell, were the words "I don't want your help, I hate you and your kind," and "Dragon killer, dragon killer, dragon killer, 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 killer." His teeth ached, a deep bruise. It was a chilly night, with winds strong enough that the little spittle of rainfall was buffeted into tiny needles that would prickle over uncovered skin like stinging nettle. His mind drifted back to the basin in the middle of the forest, with not enough cover to keep out the cold. The boy was probably freezing, not to mention his injuries. Izuku imagined him shivering by the riverbank, fingers turning blue. It kind of made him sick. But, I hate you and your kind, death by nature's hand would be a mercy. Then, a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. If I let him die, I really will be a dragon killer. Izuku sat bolt upright. Red, from a spear wound, seeping into black dirt. A wing, broken on impact. Oh gods. Oh gods. This was not a story, there was no hero waiting to sweep out of the sky and reverse Izuku's mistakes. Besides himself, there was no one in the world that knew about the boy dragon dying alone in a clearing, on some ordinary rainy night on the little Isle of 𝗏𝗏, so similar to all the other rainy nights that it would be folded into the years and dissolve there, swallowed up by the great jaws of time. And Izuku didn't know it, but for half of a moment following his heart and doing what was right, coalesced into a singular goal, sharp as an arrow, pointing out his window and into the night. If you're a fantastical sort of person, you might call it destiny. Izuku shoved his feet into his bots and threw on an extra tunic, 2 waistcoats, and a thick woolen cloak. He's going to hate you for saving him, a voice whispered in his ear. Let him hate me, then, Izuku thought back, let him hate me, but let him be alive. In less than a minute, he'd collected everything he needed from around his room and was sprinting across the plains and towards the forest, slipping and stuttering over the wet grass. It was entirely too dark to take the gulf, even if Izuku hadn't been carrying bottles and bandages, so he stumbled through the forest on sheer instinct. The half-shut eye of the moon, striped with the trunks of trees Izuku ran past, watched over the island uncaringly. Please let him be alive, Izuku was to himself, tripping over roots and stones. Please, 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 he was alive. Frozen to the touch, lying prone in pool of moonlight, easy rising shallowly, so shallowly, and eyes not entirely lucid under fluttering lids, but alive. Izuku exhaled a breath and got to work. The wound had clotted, finally, and Izuku cleaned and bandaged it, but the boy had lost so much blood it might not even matter. His pulse fluttered weakly under Izuku's fingers. Come on. Izuku fed some honey into the opening of his water skin and did his best to trickle it into the boy's mouth, feeling desperate. Come on, come on, come on. After what seemed like an age, his throat worked to swallow it. Izuku nearly cried with relief. Once the water skin was empty, he set about building a fire and maneuvering the boy into the extra clothes Izuku had worn. For this very reason, blushing furiously and firmly keeping his eyes above the waist. Once the fire was blazing properly, sheltered from the drizzle under a rocky outcrop, Izuku half-carried, half-dragged the boy to lie beside it. He stirred briefly. Oh, was that? Sure, Izuku whispered, don't move. You'll warm up soon. The boy squinted up at him. Oh, sorry. Izuku dropped a handful of the driest sticks he could find, which were all still vaguely damp, into the fire. I know you said you didn't want me to, but I couldn't just leave you, and it's okay if you hate me. I won't exactly be happy about it, but I'd understand. For what it's worth though, I really am sorry I shot you. The boy's head lolled towards him. You ever shut up, he slurred, clearly still out of it. Izuku bit his lip. Sorry. The boy didn't appear to hear him. Instead he shifted a little and then made an aborted noise of pain and tried to roll to his left, which would have sent him straight into the fire. Hey, whoa. Izuku caught him by the arm, and the boy groaned through gritted teeth. Izuku let go. Effing shoulder, the boy hissed, words blurring, dumb wing, and then you slammed me on it. The wing. Izuku drifted off. He hadn't seen any breaks or swelling in the boy's arm or around his back, but he was pretty sure that didn't really indicate anything in a person that could change their corporeal form, so. The guilt layered and layered. He rolled the boy gently onto his uninjured side, making sure not to jostle the new bandages. Better. Izuku tossed another chunk of wood into the fire, listening to it snap. Outside the tiny alcove, the rain continued to beat down. Izuku drew his legs up to his chin and wrapped his arms around them, watching the steady rise and fall of the boy's tea and the flicker of reflected firelight in his eyes. "What's your name?" The question was out of his mouth before Izuku could stop it. "Ka," the boy started, and then scrunched his face up. "No, you know what, F you." "Shut up." "I'm Izuku," Izuku offered, and Ka something eyed him dubiously. "Deku. That's such a dumb name." Izuku didn't bother to correct him. His words were getting quieter now, almost soft. He'd probably sleep soon. "Better than Ka," Izuku replied, mostly under his breath, "although I guess I can call you Kaken." The boy, Kaken, didn't answer. Izuku checked, "Yep. Fast asleep." He smiled quietly to himself. Come morning, Kaken might hate his guts, but at least he'd be alive, and that would mean Izuku wouldn't be a dragon killer. That was good enough. He buried his mouth in his knees and drifted. Izuku had only meant to rest for a minute, but he woke to a sky gray and bright, and a fire that was nothing but a pile of knotted black ash. For a moment he thought he saw the red of Kaken's eyes like a slice along his face, but when Izuku checked again there was nothing. He sighed, rubbed the feeling back into his arms, and went to find them some breakfast. A few fat haddocks were waving lazy on the surface of the lake, so he speared them and set them over a new fire. Just over the edge of a clearing was a bush heavy with blackberries, and he stripped it bare while the smell of cooking fish filled the basin. When it was finished, he wrapped Kaken's half of the food in a few wide leaves he'd cleaned in the lake and thought of heading back. Would that be the better thing to do? He didn't know. "So what's your effin' deal, huh?" Izuku startled so badly he nearly dropped his food. "W. You're awake." Kaken glared at him, no less angry for just having woken up. "Seems so. You here to be barbecued?" Izuku scrambled back. "I just couldn't leave me. Yeah, I got it. I remember your stupid speech, Deku." Izuku opened his mouth, and then shut it again. Kaken scoffed. There was silence in the clearing for a second, and then Kaken spoke again. "So who's the traitor?" His voice was black with anger. "Which pathetic f-in worm am I gonna have to gut?" "Traitor? What are you talking about? Don't f-in play dumb with me," he sneered, "the language that's coming out of your stupid face. Who taught you?" Izuku's expression twisted in confusion. "Norse. All the Vikings speak Norse. I suppose my mother and father taught me." Kaken looked like he wanted to hit him. "Stop f-in prancing around the question. How did you learn to speak the language of the dragon tongue?" Izuku paused, and then said very slowly, "I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. I've never heard of it." Kaken squinted at him for a moment. Red eyes to green. There was something vaguely hypnotic about it, like the boy was Izuku's soul away. Then his face went slack. "F in hell," he said, voice hoarse, "you're telling the truth?" Izuku frowned a little at that. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because I can understand you," Kaken said, still looking at Izuku like he was a ghost, "and I'm speaking Dragonese. Don't know a lick of Norse, either. How the F is this happening right now?" Izuku was finding it a little difficult to follow the conversation. He shrugged. Kaken cracked his knuckles. "If I wasn't f-in dying I'd knock your teeth out, you know?" Izuku did know, but it didn't make it any less awkward to hear aloud. He steepled his fingers together nervously, reaching for something to say. "There's food," he gestured to the parcel of leaves. "It's just haddock and berries, but you should eat. You should eat." "Don't tell me what to," Kaken snapped, but he reached for the leaves. Izuku tried not to watch him, but it was hard. He ate like he knew what to do with his hands, like he wasn't a stranger to the bends and movements of human fingers, so different from dragon talents. "Are you a witch?" Izuku blurted out before he could stop himself. Kaken grinned meanly around his mouthful. "Absolutely, his canines were very, very sharp, and I eat stupid idiots like you for breakfast?" Izuku felt the BLD drain from his face. "Why to be breakfast?" Kaken snickered. "God, your face. Relax, you effin' walnut, I'm no murderer. And you'd probably taste like SHT anyway." Izuku was mostly sure he was joking. Even so, he surreptitiously scooted away. What are you then?" "A dragon." "But, final answer. Now shut up." Izuku tried his best to force down the tirade of question that rolled behind his teeth now that most of the terror and confusion had abated for now. Can I ask one thing? What, exactly, does shut up mean in your culture? Do all dragons transform into people? Izuku pressed determinedly, just tell me and I'll be quiet, I promise. Please. Kaken's mouth puckered in annoyance. Why'd you care, any? It's not gonna stop you from killing us. Izuku gaped. You kill us too, he said, voice raising. You attack us? On your island, maybe? Kaken shot back. You ever been to the ugly thug slave lands? The murderous mountains. You started it, and don't think saving me, he spat the words like they tasted bitter, erases any of that. Your hands are dripping in dragon blood. Izuku crossed his arms. I can't speak for anyone outside my tribe, but all my life it's been the dragons who initiated, not us. Kaken's face twisted uglily, and I bet you think that makes you clean as a whistle, huh? You ever think about why we're attacking before you stick a sword into our spines? Izuku shifted uncomfortably. I've never stuck a sword in anything. Before. Kaken snorted. Sorry, I meant speared us out the sky. Ripped our wings with barbed wire. Axed us through the brains. Shot arrows. Stop. Izuku interrupted, feeling sick. I know it's horrible, the weapons and everything. I'm sorry. I should have realized sooner, it's sea cruel. Kaken clapped his hands together sarcastically. Wow, lucky me, a killer with a conscience? I'm not a killer, what? 'Cause dragons aren't really alive? Kaken jeered, yeah, doesn't count if it's not a Viking, I've never killed a dragon. It rung around the clearing. Kaken paused. Say that again. Izuku looked him straight in the face. I've never killed a dragon. Kaken searched his gaze for a long moment, and then every muscle in his body seemed to soften. Even the crease between his brows smoothed over. Well, that's a story. A Viking who hasn't killed a dragon. He looked Izuku over, like he was seeing him for the first time. So why'd you shoot me down? Izuku flushed and avoided eye contact. Kaken made a noise. So you're a Viking that hasn't killed a dragon yet. Good to know. Never, I'll never kill one, Izuku said, shaking his head furiously. It's wrong. So wrong. I couldn't kill you because of how wrong it is. Kaken appraised him again. Some of them deserve it. What? You're telling me there ain't some humans that would be better off as worm food? There are some evil 𝗵𝗃s out there, dragons are no different. But I don't think anybody deserves to die. Kaken rolled his eyes. So naive. Izuku bristled a little. He wasn't naive, hey. I know plenty. It's not about what you know, Deku, it's about what you've seen. And you've seen nothing. Izuku ate the blackberry. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. No, you don't. I so do. I mean, look at you, Kaken waved a hand at him. Izuku frowned. You just gestured to all of me. Bingo. Ugh. You're sitting in front of a predator that could literally rip you limb from limb. Kaken tossed a blackberry and caught it in his mouth. Your spear is by the lake, your sword is knows where, and I'm not even a little bit restrained. I could bite your head off if I wanted to. You copy. Izuku tightened his fists. Kaken was right, it hadn't even crossed his mind. But, you won't, he hated that it came out as a question. Kaken's mouth widened, stained purple from the juice. Whatever. But still, you're a child. Izuku felt his face scrunch. So are you. You're probably not even older than me. Kaken eyed him and didn't answer. Instead he said, how'd you know what to do with my wing? It sounded a little curious, but mostly accusing. Izuku focused on the curious part. A healer in the village told me. Like, not about fixing a broken wing specifically, that would have been an awkward conversation, huh? But the basics, I guess. And I've had some experience with injuries before, human injuries that is, but I was just kind of winging it, pun so not intended. I'm so sorry, I just did what I thought made sense. And I don't even know if it worked, honestly, or where the splint is now, did you take it off? Or, Izuku quickly stuffed the last of the berries into his mouth to shut himself up. Kaken's expression was somewhere between constipation and reluctant amusement. You really don't get out much, huh? Izuku flushed and mumbled something around his berries. Kaken chewed thoughtfully on a fishbone. The splint it's still on the wing. I can fold up certain stuff into the space between forms, I guess. Takes concentration, but I'm the F-in best, so it's fine. Izuku nearly vibrated out of his skin with curiosity. Did it transfer over? As in, is your shoulder blade broken too? Kaken rolled his arm. Oh, it's fine. Enough questions. Right? Sorry. And stop apologizing. Izuku threw more wood on the fire. So you didn't tell anyone back home about the magical, transforming dragon, then? Kaken was watching him carefully, the lines of his forearms tense. Izuku shook his head a little wryly. Even if I did, no one would believe me. But no. He stretched his legs out, wincing a little and palming the bandage mindlessly. I won't be able to leave this place till my wing heals up. Home's about a day's flight. He shot Izuku a look. Don't ask where, I ain't telling. Izuku held up his palms in a placating gesture. Kaken huffed. Whatever. Anyway, leave your spear so I can eat. But you shouldn't be fishing with your wound. It'll tear. What other option have I got? Kaken groused. And why the F do you even care? It's my fault you're stuck here, Izuku said firmly, pretending not to hear the din. Right it is, Kaken muttered under his breath, so I have to make sure you get out? Otherwise I really will be a dragon killer, Izuku didn't add. So what, you're going to come and feed me like a f-in mother goose? And change your bandages? Izuku crossed his arms stoutly, and keep bringing you clothes? He ignored the fact that his own clothes were a little too tight and short on Kaken. Izuku would borrow or something. To his surprise, Kaken laughed shortly. It was sarcastic, but raspy and nice sounding. Izuku felt his stomach do a weird flip. You really are crazy, Kaken told him. Okay then, Deku, go ahead. I guess you owe me anyway. So Izuku returned the next day. And the next, striking up a weird, circumstantial sort of friendship with Kaken the boy dragon until he was strong enough to fly off. And that, reader, might have been the end of our story. Might have, if Izuku had not been exiled. 10 months before exile, Izuku my boy, All Might boomed around mouthfuls of kipper, we haven't seen you in the amphitheater for a while. You really should stop by today and join us for a spot of training. What do you say? Izuku grimaced. It hadn't even been a week since he'd began visiting Kaken in the basin in the middle of the forest, and he was already running out of excuses. I can't today. But there's plenty of time after you finish at the forge. It'll still be light outside. All Might mistook the expression on Izuku's face for apprehension and laughed boisterously. Don't worry. We'll use the wooden swords this time. No need to lose your eyebrows again. He clapped Izuku on the back so hard he nearly face-planted into his porridge. Father, I'm actually not going to the forge today either. All Might looked baffled. Izuku hurried to explain. I've been doing some, private training in the forest past Hooligan Harbor. Practicing sword fighting and axe throwing, that sort of thing. All Might didn't look convinced. Why not practice in the amphitheater with the rest of us? Or the terrain. It's very rocky and sticky. With sticks. Makes it more challenging. All Might's brow cleared. Excellent, excellent, he said heartily, returning to his kipper. Taking initiative is the mark of a young hero. Why, when I was a boy, Izuku sunk into his seat with relief. Inko smiled from next to him and whispered, make sure to let Aizawa know you won't be around today, sweetheart, as All Might regaled his inattentive audience with some foregone story of his impressive youth. Izuku sunk even lower. He'd forgotten about Aizawa. It was a rare, sunny day on Berk today, still cold enough that dew on the high grasses had frozen into beads, but bright and almost pleasant in the bits of the fields not washed with shade. Unfortunately, Aizawa's mood had not lifted with the weather. Again he asked, in probably the flattest, most unimpressed tone of voice this side of the Inner Isles, when Izuku arrived looking guilty. Izuku winced. Wise, are you asking me? Yes. No, I'm not. Not asking you, that is. But yes, as in, yes, I'm going again. I won't be here. Just to clarify. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, so long and uncomfortable that Izuku was sure Aizawa was deliberately drawing it out. When Aizawa did speak again, he continued to sound unimpressed. Right? Well, I'll need you in at least 1 day this week. Tomorrow? Izuku squeaked, bowing low. From dawn until dusk, you won't even have to touch a hammer, I promise. I'm looking forward to it, Aizawa replied dryly, pointedly opening the door to the forge. Izuku bowed again and scrambled out, tossing a million thank yous over his shoulder. He was getting pretty quick at making it to the basin. On the days he brought supplies to change Kaken's bandages, he'd begun nicking his mother's sealskin pouch and securing it to his back while he swam the gulf. Otherwise, running through the forest was becoming easier and easier. Izuku found himself actually looking forward to it most mornings. Kaken was sitting on a shelf by the water's edge when Izuku arrived. He hesitated at the top, feeling a little awkward. Despite their surprisingly cordial, could Izuku call it cordial? Kaken was sort of rude, but he didn't mind it. Exactly, conversation a few days ago, Kaken had been as closed off as a clamshell. Mostly he just ignored Izuku and ran through a series of strange, meticulous exercises that bent him into complicated shapes and swore viciously when his side or shoulder got in the way. He ate the food Izuku gave him like it was a particularly unpleasant chore, and had a habit of jabbing a tin fork in his direction and saying things like, "This ain't charity, shitty Deku, don't forget," when Izuku would look at him too long. Changing his bandages was a whole other matter. Hesitantly, Izuku crept down the boulders. Kaken didn't acknowledge him, gazing out onto the water, bare feet dangling. Izuku cleared his throat. "Hi." Kaken didn't move. Izuku tried again. "How did you sleep?" "Fine." So it was a one-word answer type of a day. Izuku tried really hard not to feel resentful. Kaken didn't owe him anything, he knew that. But, well, it was kind of pathetic, but he was sort of hoping that they'd become friends over the weeks Kaken stayed to heal his wing. He couldn't help it. Kaken was like the coolest person he knew, cooler than any of the heroes in the stories, because which of them could turn into a dragon? But it made sense that someone like that wouldn't really see the point in befriending someone as unremarkable as Izuku. It didn't make him sad, exactly, it was just a fact. Izuku scrabbled around in his satchel for the dried meat and flatbread and other items he'd snagged from the larder earlier that morning, and handed the lot to Kaken, who didn't thank him. That was okay, he probably didn't need to, since it was Izuku's spear that had pinned him to this little backwash island anyway. Next to him, Kaken made an abrupt noise. Izuku started in surprise. Kaken was staring, wide-eyed, at whatever he had just taken a bite out of. Izuku peered over his shoulder. "Are you okay? Did you not like it?" "What is this?" Kaken asked sharply, flattening his palms so the piece of food rolled into view. "What the F is this? Tell me now." Sausage." Kaken narrowed his eyes at him. "A sausage?" Izuku held his hands up in defense. "Most people like them. I just assumed dragons eat meat, but if you don't like it, I won't bring it again." "Here, eat something else." Izuku tried to take it from him, but Kaken drew his hand away. "There's a flavor in it. Something zappy." Izuku his head slightly. "Zappy? You mean the chili? That might be a spicy sausage. Sorry, I should have checked." When Izuku reached forwards again, Kaken stuffed the rest of it into his mouth and smacked his lips. "Bring it every f-in day, Deku. And more SHT with that spicy in it. It's good." Izuku glowed. "Sure. I'm glad you like it, Kaken." Kaken stopped chewing. "What did you just call me?" Izuku felt himself go white. "Nothing. The F is a Kaken's. You wouldn't tell me your name. What am I supposed to call you?" "You're not supposed to call me anything." Kaken flicked a piece of flatbread at him. "You're not supposed to be here." Izuku stuck his chin out. "Well, I'm here. And if you don't tell me your name, I'm going to keep calling you Kaken, while you call me Deku. It's not like that's any different. I can do whatever I want. So can I." "Fine. Yeah, fine." Izuku sat through the tense silence up until Kaken finished his breakfast before he couldn't take it anymore. "I could bring some chili seeds if you want." Kaken didn't answer, but Izuku could tell he was listening. He plowed on, "To grow a bush here. So you can have spice anytime you want." Kaken was wearing the expression of someone who was trying very hard not to look interested. He shrugged. Bring it then. I don't care. Izuku smothered a grin in his shoulder, and then gently nudged Kaken's knee, but then Kaken's whole leg stiffened, so maybe that wasn't okay for them to do. Izuku cleared his throat around his embarrassment. I'll only bring the chili seeds if you answer a question for me. Kaken bared his teeth. You piece of, just one question, Izuku said loudly. I won't ask any more. I swear. Kaken shifted a little. Frowned angrily. The seeds, and also you shut the F up for the rest of the day. Sure, Izuku agreed easily, too easily maybe, because Kaken added, and bring me a weapon tomorrow. Izuku paused. He didn't need to think too hard to know that would be a really bad idea. Kaken already had talons and teeth and fire and probably many more equally dangerous and terrifying Izuku-killing features within his reach. A sword would be like a toothpick in comparison, right? Fine, Izuku said, but promise to answer my question. Kaken crossed his arms. Depends on the question. But sure, whatever. Izuku didn't hesitate. Do all dragons transform into people? It was the question Izuku had asked almost a week ago, the one Kaken had refused to answer. Izuku watched his mouth tighten. I can't tell you. Why not? Kaken stared at him. You can't be this stupid. Use your effin' brain. Izuku was many things, but stupid was not one of them. Probably. Hopefully. Point being, he did, unfortunately, understand. They were effectively strangers, and if it were the case that all dragons had the ability to transform into humans, it was a secret they'd kept extremely well and probably for good reason. If Izuku were Kaken, he'd be more than reluctant. But that still hadn't stopped him from hoping. Right. Awkward silence. Izuku shifted his weight over his feet. And then an olive branch. I'll still bring the chili seeds. Then the sword. Bad idea, bad idea, bad idea. Kaken made a noise in the back of his throat. That's 2 out of 3. You gonna be quiet? You didn't answer my question. That's 'cause it was a dumb F-in question. Literally, how does that make any sense? At least I'm getting you the other stuff, and oh, that was the wrong thing to say. Kaken bared his teeth. At least. You gotta be F-in joking, he snarled. Forgive me if I'm not F-in grateful about being stuck in this shithole while the wing you broke heals enough to fly me the F out of here. Yeah, just let me lick your F-in boots. Why don't I? He turned away to stare venom at the lake. Izuku bit his lip. Kaken was right. Izuku could bend over backwards and it still wouldn't atone for even half of what he'd done, intentional or not. You're right, he mumbled, ashamed. I'll be quiet. Sorry. I'm sorry. He wandered away to the far side of the clearing. Izuku felt Kaken's eyes on him, but he didn't meet them. After a painful couple of hours of surreptitiously watching Kaken complete his exercises in his periphery, and an awkward meal of roasted fish from the lake, Izuku decided to just leave Kaken the leftovers and head back early. Kaken watched him sling his satchel over his shoulder. I'm not coming tomorrow, Izuku said, avoiding eye contact, but there's enough fish to last you, and I left some flatbread too. It should keep. Kaken didn't say anything. Izuku rocked back and forth on his heels, feeling distinctly unwanted and a little bit terrible for it. Anyway, I better go. Kaken caught his elbow and held. Listen, he started, sounding almost uncertain for the first time, and it threw Izuku off balance enough for him to go limp in his hold. Listen, I get that it was a mistake to shoot me down. Or it became a mistake, whatever. You're not effing evil. You didn't know. It's what you grew up in, I guess. Izuku knew his mouth had popped open in disbelief. Kaken's red eyes flickered to his, then away again, hand squeezing his elbow so hard it creaked a little. And I know you don't have to keep coming here. You'll be in deep SHT if they catch you, right? Izuku nodded slowly, and Katsuki continued, yeah. So it's probably even then. Don't do that pouting CRP with your face. I can't tell you SHT, but it's not 'cause of you. Nobody can know, you get it. Izuku nodded again, feeling lighter. The hand on his elbow flexed, like an instinct, and Izuku almost leaned into it, but that would have been ridiculous. It was just, he hadn't been touched like that in such a long time. He visited Grandma Chiyo on his way home to stock up on bandages. She'd never once asked him why he needed so many, but she always had this telling look on her wrinkled face whenever he stopped by. Izuku found himself sitting at her worn wooden table more afternoons than not, cheek pillowed on his forearms as he watched her eat together some interesting-looking medicinal jelly or delicious cake batter. Today was one of those afternoons, and she'd set a plate of fresh rolls thick with creamy butter in front of him. Izuku was steadily making his way thought them all. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗲, he asked suddenly, mouth full and cheeks bulging, how did the war with dragons start anyway? 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗲 went very still. Why do you ask? Izuku swallowed his bread and shrugged, trying to look innocent. No reason. Just curious, I guess. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗲 chuckled, and some of the tension that had gathered in the room broke. Ah, Izuku. Always the curious one. Well, I can't tell you the whole story, unfortunately, that would take far too long. But I can tell you that it had something to do with breaking a binding vow. Izuku gasped. Everyone who was anyone had heard of binding vows and all the dreadful tales that accompanied breaking one. Death, eternal misery, a curse unimaginable, the whole kit and caboodle. The best and most action-packed hero stories often had some sort of vow, between lovers, between friends turned enemies, between enemies turned friends. He'd never heard of one in real life, of course, but Izuku had seen too much magic in the past week to doubt their existence. Do you know what they swore? Or who it was? Izuku asked, leaning forward, roles forgotten. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗲 nodded sagely, yes, of course. It was quite horrible. Very fiddly. Afraid that's all I can tell you for now, though, so run along. Your mother will be waiting for you at home, no doubt. Izuku reluctantly did as he was told, head full of eternal promises and noble quests and all the other things he could fit into something as powerful as a binding vow, if he was so inclined. Or if he had someone willing to do it with. 9 months and 3 weeks before Exile, 𝗧𝗂𝗃 was excellent with a sword. Swift and clean and graceful, like an arc of water through the air, perfectly executing all the complicated moves Izuku had described, and tried and failed to demonstrate, to him as if he'd been born knowing how. He would easily beat any of the boys and girls their age back in Izuku's village. On the other hand, Izuku was so bad at it that 𝗧𝗂𝗃 would take time out of his training to laugh at him. The 4th time that day Izuku found himself face down in the grass, 𝗧𝗂𝗃 laughed so hard he nearly joined him. He did, however, reach out a hand and clasped Izuku's forearm to help haul him up, so Izuku wasn't too disgruntled about it. I'm trying, he insisted, picking the burrs out of his tunic. My arm just won't do what I'm telling it to. Yeah, but how does that end up with you eating dirt? Izuku held up the sword that was nearly as long as his arm. It unbalances me. Get a different one then, 𝗧𝗂𝗃 said, spinning his own sword around his arm like it was nothing. Come on, he wasn't even that much taller than Izuku. He really didn't understand how a few inches made so much of a difference. I'm not a full member of the tribe yet, Izuku sighed, readying his stance again to begin swiping at the air. I can't request weapons. Then become one. Izuku gave him a look. That's what I was trying to do the day I shot you down. 𝗧𝗂𝗃 screwed up his nose, like he'd smelled something bad. That's effing sick. You had to bring back my heart or something. Your head actually, Izuku told him, and 𝗧𝗂𝗃 made another face. Izuku didn't bother asking what 𝗧𝗂𝗃 had to do to be initiated into his own tribe. He knew he wouldn't get an answer. 9 months and 2 weeks before Exile, the hooligan village was rife with celebration. The sun had long since set, but bonfires drowned the town square in lush golden light, illuminating tables of food, the men playing fiddles, the barrels upon barrels of all manner of alcohol, the sight and sound of people dancing together on hard-packed dirt, 𝗧𝗃𝗃, hands clasped and skirts spinning. It was Thursday, and the Vikings were welcoming the spring. Deep in the forest past Hooligan Harbor was a giggling boy with 2 bottles, one in each hand, stumbling towards a basin where a dragon lay sleeping. Izuku really hadn't had that much to drink. Only 1 mug half filled with froth anyway, and all the boys his age had had many more than him, but the mead was rich and hit his BLD in warm, sweet waves, and he'd wanted 𝗧𝗂𝗃 to feel it with him. He finally made it to the tumble of boulders, laughing hysterically when he couldn't use his hands to help himself down and wobbling like a newborn fawn. 𝗧𝗂𝗃, he shouted, the moment he made it to the grass below. 𝗧𝗂𝗃, come. I have a gift. Two large, warm hands gripped Izuku by the shoulders and hauled him forward. "What are you doing?" A voice hissed, a nice voice, wow, like a river rushing over fresh gravel, and Izuku swayed forward. "It's the middle of the night, dipshit. Are you for F's? Sake, are you drunk?" Izuku giggled and swayed again. "No, just," he emphasized the 𝗧𝗏 annoyed that it seemed to be falling off the ends of his words. "Just happy. And a little drunk maybe, but only maybe Kaken." He waved the bottles under Kaken's nose. "Brought us some?" Kaken peered into Izuku's eyes under his hair, hands still heavy on his shoulders. It felt so good, like a weighted blanket, sending tendrils of warmth all down his spine and up to tingle his cheeks, and if Izuku wasn't ruddy from the alcohol then it probably would have tinged them pink. "Is that effin' mead?" "All Might's mead," Izuku said mischievously, and then, the best in the village, when Kaken's expression didn't change. "You allowed that tea?" Izuku shrugged. Kaken's face split into a wide, pointy grin. "You might have," he said, but it almost sounded affectionate. "Gimme one, what the F? It's Solstice, ain't it?" Izuku didn't know what Solstice was, but he nodded vigorously and let go of one of the bottles. Kaken swore and dived to catch it before it shattered, which meant that his lovely hands were no longer on Izuku's shoulders, leaving him horribly bereft. "Kaken," he said mournfully, and Kaken stopped shouting at him about dropping the bottle. He swore, "Deku, come on, get that look off your face, what did I do?" "God, for eyes, cut it out, damn it." Izuku felt his bottom lip wobble and Kaken swore again, Hey, don't effing cry, let's drink some of this, yeah?" Izuku perked up immediately, forgetting about hands and shoulders for the moment, and pulled the cork on his own bottle. The mead sloshed over the lip a little as they clinked them together. "Bottoms up, Deku," and Kaken tipped his head towards the winking moon. Izuku watched as his throat worked, as the blonde of his hair washed to gray shot through with little flecks of deep dark, and felt unsteady from something entirely unrelated to the booze. He hastily gulped at the mouth of his bottle, a little too quickly, spluttering against the warm burn that raced down his throat in the wake of the sweet, thick liquor. This is some heavy-duty SHT, Deku. How the F did you get here without effin' dying?" "Walked," Izuku told him, and Kaken flicked his forehead. "No duh, idiot. You go stupid when you're drunk, you know that. More stupid than usual." Izuku pouted at him and collapsed into the grass. "That's mean. I'm effin' mean. Deal with it." But he joined Izuku on the ground. Izuku made it through about half his bottle before he couldn't take any more, and Kaken plucked it out of his hands and down the rest. His whole body felt floaty and light and a bit unreal, like he was dissolving at the edges and leaking all over the grass, but he could hear Kaken and see Kaken and almost feel Kaken where their shoulders were a hand's breadth away, and it stapled him back to earth. It was a clear night, an expanse of inky blue-black stretching far above the tops of even the tallest trees, spackled with clusters of glinting white stars. Kaken began pointing out constellations Izuku had never heard of, a man brandishing an arrow, a lion on its hind legs, all with strange, appealing names that ran over Izuku's skin. "That one there," Kaken was saying, and Izuku tilted his head to better follow his finger. "Right there, with the, F in tail or something. That long bit at the end. Keep your eye on that for a day's flight and it'll take you straight to—" Kaken stopped abruptly. Izuku struggled towards him, trying to gauge the expression on his face. Kaken's eyes flickered to his, then away again. "Straight to what?" Izuku pressed, wavering on his elbows. "Nothing," Kaken replied tersely, "nothing. Forget it." But Izuku didn't want to forget it. He stretched out a leg and knocked Kaken's ankle. "Straight to what, Kaken? I won't tell anyone." "Well, I don't effin' know that, now do I?" Kaken grumbled back, and Izuku was sure that was something he'd never have admitted without the alcohol. It made sense, of course it did, they were at war, but sense didn't stop the twinge of hurt from scampering through Izuku's eye. He swallowed once, twice, then lay back down in the grass. "Sorry," he mumbled, and Kaken twitched a little, as if he was going to say something. And then, like magic, the conversation Izuku had had with Grandma Chiyo came rushing back to him and he bounded to his feet, listing sideways, 'cause he'd stood up too fast. "Kaken," he breathed, tripping a little, Kaken, what about a binding vow? Izuku was fully prepared to explain exactly what a binding vow was and how it would help them, but Kaken's face darkened with recognition. Deku, that's old magic. We can't mess with that. Why not, he urged. We won't break it, and that way we can talk properly and be friends. Kaken mouthed the word friends to himself, looking conflicted, so Izuku hurried to smooth it over. And you won't have to worry about me telling anyone about the, He gestured vaguely at Kaken's prone body. Dragon-human thing. Right. Wouldn't that be good? The booze was making Kaken's face almost transparent, and Izuku watched his indecision flash there. You'll be gone soon anyway, he wheedled, thinking just a little more, and we'll make it an easy one, I promise. The heroes in the stories always do it wrong anyway. Come on, Kaken, unless... Inspiration struck like a match, unless you're scared. Kaken shot upright, scowling. I ain't scared, shitty Deku. Izuku crossed his arms clumsily, doing his best to look nonchalant. Are you sure? It kinda sounds like you're scared. That's okay, Kaken. We don't have to. Kaken hauled himself to his feet, scowling. Shut up, I ain't scared. 𝗬𝗵𝗲, you scheming piece of... I'll show you scared, huh? That dumb vow is scared of me. He fished the sword Izuku gave him from behind its boulder and held it out. Well, he demanded, when Izuku only looked at it blankly, you wanna go first or what? I don't know how to do it, Izuku replied haltingly, and Kaken rolled his eyes so far back he might have seen his brain. Useless, left hand, Deku, and he snatched Izuku's left hand from where it was hanging limp at his side and pressed the palm against the sharp side of the blade. A jolt of hot pain, and then aching silence inside him. Izuku stared at the new line on his palm, deep enough to scar, at the jewel-bright beads of red welling there. Kaken pressed the sword against his own palm and held it out. Now what? Izuku asked dumbly, and Kaken huffed a little and pressed their matching cuts together hard enough to sting. A zap and a sizzle in Izuku's 𝗬𝗲𝗍 sounded like a cord from his heart to his palm to Kaken's palm, to something huge and powerful in the corners, or maybe the sky. He shivered. Kaken's hands were just as warm as they'd been on his shoulders, a little damp from the dew on the grass, and sweetly calloused on the fingertips. Motes of starlight caught and pooled in eyes. Izuku shivered again. Swear you'll keep my secrets, Kaken rasped, quiet in the wavering night, and Izuku swore it. That cord tugged and pulled, wrapped around the strings still singing under his skin, lurching him forwards into Kaken and knocking their knees together. Kaken's hand around his squeezed and squeezed. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 trickled at the seam. Ask me for something, Kaken told him, and Izuku swallowed and said, swear you'll keep my secrets too, and the cord coiled like a spring when Kaken repeated it back to him. For a moment the air between them went taut and Izuku flashed to Kaken's point of view, seeing himself wide-eyed and tousle-haired and painfully earnest looking with a scarred hand outstretched, and then he was catapulted back into his own body again. Izuku gagged and fell to his knees, stomach swirling. Next to him, Kaken did the same. Their hands were still clasped and Izuku was sure his had gone clammy and gross, but it felt so nice and good in an intense, burning way, and when Izuku finally finished dry heaving and collapsed onto his back beside their empty bottles he sort of left it there, hoping Kaken wouldn't notice. But of course he did notice and he peeled their palms apart, sticky with drying 𝗬𝗲𝗍. Is it done? Izuku asked the open sky, shiny and raw as a wound. Yeah. Izuku could hear crickets singing in the cluster of bushes just behind them. The mead, still warm in his 𝗬𝗲𝗍, gave him the courage to ask, can all dragons turn into humans then? For a second he was sure Kaken wouldn't answer. Then Izuku heard the rush of his exhale. Yeah. We were cursed or 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Izuku felt the thrum of the vows sealing the information away in his memory. It was a weird, almost uncomfortable sensation, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. It was like the bond knew which secrets were the important ones, like it read Kaken's intentions and wove them in. This was to stay between them. Thank you, he whispered, already feeling himself drifting into a wonderful, liquor-sodden sleep. Kaken said something back, but Izuku was already dreaming. Many islands away, in woods much older and more dangerous than those on the Isle of 𝗏𝗏, in a small, crumbling cottage with a thatched roof and a chimney half caving in on itself, a man sat bolt upright in his chair. As if learning to walk for the first time, he stumbled out onto the rickety porch with its crumbling railing and rotten floorboards and gazed towards where the sea winked and swirled beyond the thick of the trees. History repeating itself. A boy and a dragon, making a binding vow on the night of the last day of winter. A serpent, forever eating its own tail. 9 months before Exile. "Hi. It's me," Izuku called, and quickly leapt down the boulders. He was too far away to see Kaken roll his eyes, but he felt it. Who the F else would it be? Dunno. Izuku bounded over and sat next to him, just in time to catch the end of a second eye roll. Kaken was sitting by the lake again today, the flick of his toes sending ripples through the green glass surface. Izuku immediately pulled off his shoes and joined him. "You're late," Kaken said, and Izuku lit up with the thought that maybe Kaken had kinda sort of missed him possibly, and he must have mumbled it out loud because the tops of Kaken's ears had flamed red, and he was shouting, "No I didn't, stupid Deku. Did those words come out of my mouth? Get that idea out your fat head," and shoving him so hard that Izuku unbalanced and toppled into the water with a splash. Kaken, he spluttered when he finally surfaced, feet kicking at the soft, loose mud below the rocky dip. Kaken looked down at him, smug. "That's what you get." Izuku wrapped wet fingers around his ankle and dragged Kaken, kicking and screaming, into the water beside him. "You really should have seen that coming," he told him, while Kaken spat and hissed like an angry cat. Kaken shoved his head underwater. They wrestled like that for a while, drifting further into the middle of the lake. Whenever Izuku could breathe he was laughing, and Kaken's not-quite-angry shouts followed him down until the laughter turned into bubbles again, and he had to yank at the legs kicking blurrily in his field of vision so he could surface. Izuku couldn't remember ever having this much fun. Although, he'd found himself thinking that a lot lately. Eventually they got tired and clawed themselves up the riverbed to lay in the marshy reeds. All the fish had been scared away from the surface and were probably lingering close to the silted bed now, too far away for spearfishing, so Izuku shot them some birds for lunch after several unsuccessful attempts. Kaken, who as it turned out was surprisingly good at cooking, much better than Izuku at any rate, plucked and cleaned them well, and then stuffed them with sprigs of low-growing herbs Izuku didn't recognize, and plenty of long, bulby stalky vegetables that he also didn't recognize. Scallions, Kaken called them, and Izuku filed the name away for later. Once the birds were dripping sizzling fat onto the fire below them, Kaken announced them ready divided the meat between the two of them. "You really need to get me some salt Deku," Kaken told him as they ate. "I'm dying over here with all this unseasoned." Izuku thought everything Kaken made tasted delicious anyway, but promised to get him the salt. And pepper, apparently. And more varieties of chili. Kaken had the beginnings of a garden going on in one damp corner. After everything way finished and all Izuku's fingers had been clean, he and Kaken had what Izuku had affectionately dubbed question time and what Kaken had less affectionately dubbed the only entertainment option I have in this shithole, might as well make use of it, in which Izuku asked Kaken everything he could possibly come up with about the dragon world, and occasionally shared something about his own life on Kaken's insistence. "Can you change the temperature of your fire?" "No." "Can any other dragons do that?" "I don't effing know," asked them. "Can you speak in dragon form?" "No." "Why?" "I don't effing know." "Well, you can make noises, so you obviously have vocal cords? But oh, everything would have to be fireproof on the inside, wouldn't it? I wonder if that means they'd be made of a different material to human vocal cords. Or maybe they'd have some sort of coating, like a mucus. Mucus might make more sense, actually. A thick layer on the lining of your throat would inhibit more complicated noises. Shut up, shut up. That's so damn gross. Stop theorizing, creep, you're not gonna get any answers unless you're planning to dissect me. What? Are you? No. Good. I don't ever want to hear you say the word mucus again, got that fuckface. It's a perfectly natural word, Kaken. Everyone has mucus. Speak for yourself, green butt booger nerd. I ain't about that. I literally squeezed pus out of you. Barf. It saved your life. That sounds like a personal choice from where I'm sitting. You're such a 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗧𝗔𝗓, Izuku told him, kicking his feet higher against the smooth stretch of granite. Izuku was currently on his back in the gorse and heather to watch clouds creep across the gray sky, legs propped up against one of the rocky walls of their basin. Kaken was slumped against the same wall, absently tying the laces of Izuku's boots together. "And you sound like my effin' mother," Kaken replied, and Izuku threw a bit of fern at him. "So you've got to turn into humans every time you want to talk? We've got clicks and whistles and 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗔𝗧. So no. And I'm not effin' showing you, don't ask." Izuku closed his mouth, crestfallen. "But not for long. So do you shed? Like a snake?" "Oh my that. What the F?" "It's just a question," Izuku huffed and Kaken groaned. "Every day I regret that 𝗬𝗵𝗲. Why'd we do it again?" "So I don't go spilling your state secrets," Izuku said. "Sagely, and also the mead probably." Kaken groaned again. "What's it like where you're from?" Izuku found himself asking. "F-in-appealing," Kaken said after a moment, but with such conviction, like he didn't even need to think about it. "It's this massive caldera, right? And then underneath are these lava or magma chambers, I guess. I dunno what you'd call them." "Cool," Izuku hummed, watching Kaken's face upside down. "The rock's so effin' cool. None of this porosity." Kaken gestured at the layers of granite and sandstone and limestone piled around them, all volcanic. "And it smells like, I dunno, like fire." Izuku closed his eyes and inhaled, trying to imagine it. Privately, he thought Kaken also smelled a bit like fire. He must have brought it with him. And then there'd the jewel caves, SHT there's something else. Huge, like F in mountains of the stuff. Your eyes would fall out of your dumb head, I bet. Kaken was gazing into the distance at nothing, probably replaying images of his home his mind's eye. Izuku felt a hot, sharp jab of jealousy, a swift punch. Kaken's world just seemed so big and exciting, and 𝗏𝗏 was appealing in its own way, bleak and dramatic and wind-blown and rain-swept, but Kaken could fly wherever he wanted on those large, black wings. Izuku had only ever been stuck here. He cleared his throat and changed the subject. They wasted away most afternoons like that. Talking about nothing. Sword fighting. Playing stupid games with the wooden dice set Izuku had brought along one day. Sitting in silence and letting the warm thrum of the vow burble up like a spring between them. Behind the prickly exterior, and the short temper and the profanity, Izuku found that Kaken was surprisingly intelligent, and funny in a dry, sarcastic sort of way, a bit overconfident maybe, but gutsy enough that it made up for it. Every day, Izuku found himself more and more reluctant to leave their secluded glade and return to the increasingly unsatisfactory hooligan village. Maybe he was getting attached because he'd never had a person his age to just hang out with like this before, but his gut told him otherwise. They bounced off each other so easily it was almost uncanny. Izuku felt like he'd known Kaken forever, and Kaken seemed to almost enjoy having him around, which was high praise from him. Or Izuku liked to think it was, anyway. Izuku didn't really know what he'd do once Kaken left. 8 months and 2 weeks before Exile, Kaken had been transforming more and more. Izuku didn't like that part, didn't like hearing or seeing the crunch and crackle of bones extending under his skin, but he loved watching Kaken prowl around in dragon form. Recently, Kaken had begun doing these flapping hop-jump things to try and make it across the lake, pushing through the pain to test his wing in the splint. Izuku would stand on one side, cheering, until Kaken got too close and Izuku had to dive out of the way to avoid being landed on and squashed like a grape. Today, Kaken didn't even make it to the opposite bank. He crashed into the water so violently that the resulting tidal wave drenched Izuku all the way up to his knees. He was busy squeezing out the water when Kaken clawed his way up the bank and shifted with a crack beside him. "It's no effin' use," he griped, rolling his aggravated shoulder. "The splint makes me so dim and unbalanced. Feels like I'm lugging around a whole butt tree." "Sorry," Izuku said, swallowing down the familiar guilt, but Kaken didn't even acknowledge him, dragging a hand through unruly blonde spikes. "I'm gonna be stuck here forever." "No you won't," Izuku placated, thinking would that really be such a bad thing? And then mentally pinching himself for it, "You've just got to wait until the bones are a little stronger, that's all. For and ever." "You're so dramatic," Izuku huffed. "All you need is a couple of weeks." "Shut it," Kaken said, without any heat, What I really need is a rock to implant itself on my shoulder blades so I don't do a goddamn barrel roll in the middle of the air. He cut himself off, looking at Izuku with narrowed eyes. Izuku smiled, confused. What is it? Kaken's gaze dragged up and down Izuku's body. He crossed his arms over himself, trying not to shiver. You afraid of heights? Matter of fact, I don't care. Get over here. Kaken rolled his eyes. You want to help so bad, Deku? Make yourself useful and get on my back. Izuku blinked. Cleaned his ears out. Kaken mocked him. Is that all you can say? He gripped Izuku by the scruff of his tunic and twisted them around so that Kaken was crouched below him. Hold on to the spines. Lean your weight to the left. And for F's sake, don't fall off. Before Izuku could so much as shriek, Kaken crumpled and unfolded beneath him, and Izuku's field of vision was suddenly filled with black and orange scales and the beat of huge, membranous wings. Kaken! Izuku scrabbled desperately at the vaults of the spines rising on either side of him as his feet left the safety of the grass. Kaken, what are you doing, oh my gods? Kaken took about a second to swivel his head back and flash his teeth in what might have been the dragon approximation of a grin, and then leapt into the air. Izuku screamed. Up, up, up they rose, the ground rapidly falling away beneath like some horrible kaleidoscope nightmare. Kaken determinedly tilted left to slide Izuku further along his uninjured shoulder. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut and screamed until his voice was hoarse. Kaken flapped his wings, a great whoosh of air and pressure, and Izuku felt his heart crawl into his throat and lodge there. Kaken, he screeched when he finally had access to language again. Kaken, put me down. Kaken huffed somewhere in front of him and leaned left again, spilling Izuku's body weight towards his unsplinted wing. Izuku, eyes still closed, white-knuckled the spines along Kaken's back and devolved into frantic muttering. Please Thor, please don't let me die, there's so much I haven't done, Kaken be reasonable. Please Thor, please, I'll make you a really nice fire, Kaken. I can just splint your other wing to balance out your weight, please just put down Kaken, I'm actually going toady, but Kaken wasn't listening. Slowly, surely, they wobbled higher and higher into the air, until an air current billowed under Kaken's outstretched wings and the sound of rushing wind in Izuku's ears opened and hollowed like he was diving underwater. And then, after minutes, hours, days who knows, of an ascent that would take Izuku all the way into Valhalla probably, there was the strange, static sensation of hovering in place. Izuku held his breath, eyes still tightly shut. They must have been suspended hundreds of kilometers above the ISE of Berk. Kaken made an odd, snuffle roar noise and bucked him like an actual maniac. Izuku might have seen his life flash before his eyes. Kaken, stop, I'm going to fall off, I don't even have a HS or anything, Kaken bucked him again. Izuku swallowed a scream. Okay, so Kaken was trying to kill him. Despite the vow, despite their burgeoning friendship, Kaken was trying to fling him off his back so he could splatter into an Izuku pancake on the sea below. Half of Izuku didn't blame him. Weeks and weeks with no one but himself to talk to, and Izuku would be contemplating homicide too, and the other half probably would have been hurted. Izuku had space for anything else in his head other than panic. He really did want to live. He liked his village, mostly. It was no Rome, but Lady was about to have a baby sister. He couldn't miss that. No, he decided, firmly, I'm not giving up. If Kaken wants to throw me off, he's going to have to try a lot harder than that. Determined, Izuku dug his fingers into the hard bone of Kaken's wing, the wing. Kaken couldn't fly on it without the splint, and Izuku really was balancing out the weight. Even now, he felt Kaken readjusting his wings and shoulders in time with each of Izuku's minute twitches. So maybe no homicide. Unless Kaken wanted to go down with him. Definitely not, but then what was all this bucking for? And then it occurred to him. Oh, that little, I'm not opening my eyes. Izuku whisper shouted, too scared to be furious but trying his hardest anyway, the shock will give me a heart attack. And then I really will fall off. Izuku's guess was right on the money, because Kaken made that snuffle roar sound again and beat his wings almost indignantly beside him. Izuku could just about hear his taunting voice. Come on, Theo. Don't be a wuss, I thought you were a Viking. Aren't Vikings supposed to be tough? Imaginary Kaken was right. Vikings were supposed to be tough. And if he was going to die, he might as well go out with a spectacular view. So, with a deep breath, and then another when that wasn't enough, Izuku forced his eyes open. An endless, breathless blue, all around, like a dream. Kaken, a warm line beneath him, the only real thing for miles. Izuku looked down and saw for the first time that the place he lived in, the little island where he struggled and worried, was a part of an archipelago of staggering beauty, hundreds of tiny green islands, shards of a glorious, gleaming emerald, set in a shimmering sea. The vow stretched between them, inviting and delighted. And then Kaken started to move. Wind whistling, stomach swooping, hands buried in smooth scales. Izuku watched open-mouthed as Kaken lazily flapped them into a warmer, smoother air current that drifted them out towards open ocean. Izuku felt so wonderfully small, but also huge and untethered from his skin somehow, like a little boy flying a kite, or maybe the kite itself, just a sheet in that blue infinity that knew nothing but the wind and the pieces of color it was made of. And the vow, a kite's cord of spun gold. Kaken still couldn't fly for long, so he floated them over to a cluster of sea stacks and landed on the widest one, waiting for Izuku to slide down his side and onto the sandstone plateau before he transformed back with a crack. This was the first time in his life that Izuku had left Berk. It felt strangely right that Kaken would be the one to take him. Kaken, that was amazing. Izuku bounded towards him on the ball of his feet, completely forgetting about the curling white froth splash of the vicious waves below. We were so high. I've never felt anything like it. I can't believe everything was so small. And the air was different too, thinner maybe, and your wings are incredible. Did putting pressure on your shoulder blade help with your balance? How do you manage to fly against the drag when it's windy? Do you use your tail spines to turn? What about? Kaken reached forward and gripped Izuku's shoulders to keep him still, a half grin playing across his face. Chill out, nerd. I ain't saving you if you slip and die. Izuku peered down at the sheer drop and chewed on his bottom lip, weighing the insistent need to ask a billion questions against the fear of mortal doom. His longing to ask questions won out. But Kaken, how did your wing feel? Is the splint stable enough? Is it uncomfortable? Maybe I should find a lighter piece of wood, birch, or spruce. It was so amazing how you caught that updraft. How did you know it was there? Can you sense it? Izuku gasped, clutching his hands together. Kaken, can you sense the wind? Okay, that's enough. Kaken snagged him by the collar again. No rest is worth your motor mouth. Get back on. Kaken shifted, and Izuku found himself once again wrapped around what he assumed to be Kaken's left shoulder blade. He clung there, happily enjoying the breeze in his face on the ride home and etching the sights and sounds into his memory for him to dream about later, the vow curling warm in his ear. Kaken landed a little heavily this time, dragging his wing behind him. Izuku tried to ask about it, but Kaken had snapped in his face and blew a harmless puff of fire into the space above Izuku's head, so he dropped it pretty quick. When Kaken did eventually shift back, it was with a muffled grimace and a declaration of, I'm taking a nap, shitty Deku. If you wake me you die. Izuku was hopped up on the adrenaline of flying on the back of a dragon, so while Kaken slept he took a dip in the lake, and then foraged for sturdy, relatively straight branches of birch he could use to replace the much denser oak planks Kaken's wing was currently fastened to. He brought the idea up while they were eating, fish for Izuku, spicy sausage for Kaken, and Kaken rubbed a hand over his shoulder thoughtfully. Could work, he said eventually. You weren't heavy enough to completely balance my SHT out, so we'll probably need something lighter on my F-up side when we do it again. Izuku paused, tin fork halfway up to his mouth. Again, he asked, hearing his voice quiver with excitement. Kaken shot him an indecipherable look. What? You thought it was a one-time thing, Deku? I know you're AF in chicken, but I didn't pin you as a cop-out. No. Deku interrupted hastily, I'm not copping out. Let's do it again, please. So, right now, actually. And then he remembered the food, the fire, the birch branches and Kaken's aching shoulder. Or not now. So, soon is good. Or whenever you want. Anytime. Kaken was smirking a little meanly now, like he knew Izuku was embarrassing himself and he was just enjoying the show. It brought a warm flush to Izuku's cheeks, and he dropped his eyes to his feet. Anyway. 𝗂𝗂𝗄's quiet, raspy laughter followed in the dusky air. Izuku couldn't help but think he'd never heard a better sound. 8 months and 1 week before Exile, what the CRP? 𝗂𝗂𝗄, you really need a haircut? Why the CRP? Well, you can't just leave it like it is. And why the F not? Izuku stared pointedly. The mess of blonde on 𝗂𝗂𝗄's head was so long now that the ends had begun to fight against their gravity-defying nature, drooping like wet leaves. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 scowled. Fine. Gimme that 𝗧𝗜𝗍𝗔𝗍, I'll do it myself. Izuku clutched the shears he'd brought close to his 𝗧𝗍𝗍 and dodged 𝗂𝗂𝗄's angry lunge. No. You won't be able to see where you're cutting. I don't care. He lunged again. Izuku held the shears as far away from him as he could. What if you accidentally stab yourself? Or poke your eye out? Still don't care. Stop moving. Izuku thought hard. I'll bring you an axe to try out. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 froze, arm outstretched. A real one. None of that training 𝗧𝗜𝗍𝗔𝗍. Izuku gulped. Gulped again. Why? 𝗂𝗂𝗄 squinted suspiciously at him. Make it one of those double-headed F-airs and we've got a deal. Izuku glanced over at the opposite wall of the clearing, where 𝗂𝗂𝗄 had stashed all the other weapons Izuku had brought him. The sword, a few spears, a set of daggers, a bludgeon the size of his forearm, and a bow. With a quiver full of arrows, and sighed. If Aizawa hadn't already suspected someone was stealing his weapons, then he certainly would after his double-headed axe went missing. Fine. But you've got to hold still, or I won't bring it. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 grinned at him, all feral and pointy and mean and delighted. It made Izuku's stomach feel hot. Done. After Izuku had wrestled 𝗂𝗂𝗄 into sitting atop his overturned helmet, he dubiously assessed the explosion of blonde in front of him like a general scoping out his battlefield. Pass your beads. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 glared over his shoulder. The F are beads. Oh, right, sometimes I forget you're not, anyway. Izuku lifted the curtain on the side of his head, showing 𝗂𝗂𝗄 the 2 slim braids jutting out from behind his ear, stiff with tiny beads. They're for people, he said, fingering the braids. This one's for All Might, Air, my dad. This one's for 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐻, Aizawa. For each name, he touched a different colored bead, metal, stone, dried wood, woven into his hair. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 was watching, gaze flitting between the braids and Izuku's face. The attention was making him nervous, for some reason. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 swiveled around the moment Izuku was done, neck stiff. Nah, he said, voice choked, I don't like it. You F-airs are too sentimental. Get on with it already. Izuku grinned a little to himself and began snipping away pieces of 𝗂𝗂𝗄's hair, starting at the crown. Before long, there was a circle of feathery blonde on the grass around the helmet. 𝗂𝗂𝗄's hair felt wonderful in his fingers, thick and soft like corn silk, nothing like Izuku's coarse, disorderly curls that rose and fell with the humidity. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 had gone very, very still under Izuku's hands, almost as if he were holding his breath. Your hair is really nice, Izuku murmured at some point, and the backs of 𝗂𝗂𝗄's ears bloomed pink. Shut it, weirdo. Sorry. Izuku had the strangest urge to just run his fingers along 𝗂𝗂𝗄's scalp. Brush the fine hair that gathered in a point at the nape of his neck. He shook it off and continued. Izuku's fingers ghosted over the shell of 𝗂𝗂𝗄's ear. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 shivered a little, strong shoulders dipping. Sorry, Izuku said, voice low. He didn't know why he was whispering. Fine. Between them, the bond stretched, slow and warm, like a cat in the sun. It really was the strangest sensation, especially feeling the edge of 𝗂𝗂𝗄's presence at the other end of it. Kind of like hearing someone move around in a different room. Below him, 𝗂𝗂𝗄 scoffed. Stupid. It's nothing like that. Izuku wasn't even fazed that he'd apparently been mumbling aloud. What does it feel like for you, he asked, curious despite himself. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 hunched a little, forcing Izuku to chase after him with the shears. Like I've got my hand in a bucket, but you've also got your hand in the bucket, and I can feel your dumb fingers wiggling in the water. That was actually a really accurate representation of their situation. 𝗂𝗂𝗄 crossed his arms and barked, Course it is. I came up with it, didn't I? And Izuku laughed. Sometime later, Izuku patted the top of 𝗂𝗂𝗄's fluffy, shorter hair, and sprung away before 𝗂𝗂𝗏 could kill him for it. All done. Much better. Now you look less like you rolled around in the stables with the horses. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 snapped his neck around, red eyes burning. What's that, cabbage head? Get the F back here. 8 months before Exile, Izuku knew their time was nearly up. He saw it in the way 𝗂𝗏𝗏 would go quiet and stare pensively at the sky sometimes, head pillowed on his arms as they lay in the grass together. In the way the vow would sometimes stiffen and twang unhappily between them. Try as he might, Izuku couldn't remember life without 𝗂𝗏𝗏 as anything but slew of pointless days trudging after each other in a long, bedraggled line. It seemed impossible that they wouldn't have this forever, impossible that there would be a day that their basin in the middle of the woods emptied and quieted. But 𝗂𝗏𝗏 was flying a little further every day, sometimes without Izuku, even with the splint on, the bones in his powerful shoulders shifting to accommodate the weight of the wood and rope, black wings braced against the buffeting wind. Izuku knew at the end was coming, but it didn't make it hurt any less when it did. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 waited until after they'd eaten to tell him. Izuku's last mouthfuls rose in his throat. And he asked, desperately trying to keep his voice from trembling. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 was staring at the space above his head. Today, he said, with absolutely no inflection. Izuku couldn't read the expression on his face. He reached for the vow between them, but found it just as unreadable, curled up and quiet. Okay then, Izuku said, attempting to swallow, not quite managing it. Okay then. But, good luck I guess. Then, fly safe. Make sure you, holy he, why re you acting like it's my demon funeral? F off with that CRP. And put your eyes away. Izuku flicked his eyes to 𝗂𝗏𝗏's tentatively. The expression on his face was endearingly familiar, frustrated and bristling, like he wanted to fight something, but he wasn't sure who to throw his fists at. Despite himself, Izuku laughed. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 shot him a searching look. It made Izuku feel strange. Get on my back. Izuku blinked. And fasten yourself in. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 shifted abruptly. Izuku winced at the crunching, cracking noises. What now? Izuku was pretty sure that if dragons could roll their eyes, 𝗂𝗏𝗏 would be. As it was, he gestured impatiently with his head and thumped his tail against the ground. Okay, Izuku grumbled, hoisting himself up and settling in between 𝗂𝗏𝗏's wing spines. Bossy much? As quickly as he could, Izuku undid the sash at his waist and belted himself to the little valley just before 𝗂𝗏𝗏's neck met the joints of his wing, just before 𝗂𝗏𝗏 snorted smoke and kicked into the air. Izuku would never get tired of that feeling, the heady swoop in his stomach, the tingling in his fingers, the singe of his BLD under his skin, all whispering together, we're flying, flying. Izuku was grinning, and he didn't think he could stop if he tried. They rose steadily above the canopy of the forest, 𝗂𝗏𝗏's wings beating in great sheets on either side. Izuku craned his neck. There, his village in the distance, tiny wooden triangles and thumbprints of green bunched together in haphazard little bouquets. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 let them hover there for a second, flapping, and then they shot like bullets into the sky. Izuku whooped and wrapped his arms around Katsuki's scaly neck, feeling the wind roaring through his ears. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 swept past the farthest beach of the island, rocketing towards the open ocean. Izuku cupped his hand beside 𝗂𝗏𝗏's flapping ear. Where are we going? 𝗂𝗏𝗏's answer was a violent loop-the-loop. Izuku shrieked and clung tight, hollering a reproachful 𝗂𝗏𝗏 that was mostly lost to the wind. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 slapped him with a tail spine. Izuku smacked him back. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 did it again, a little harder. Eventually, Izuku figured that 𝗂𝗏𝗏 was probably telling him to hold on, and if he didn't want to die, he'd do well to listen. Izuku dug his nails in between the scales and tried to shout ready in 𝗂𝗏𝗏's ear again, but they were going so fast that the wind ripped the moisture from his mouth the moment he opened it. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 seemed to understand, anyway. Just as Izuku was struggling for oxygen, 𝗂𝗏𝗏 folded his magnificent wings in. For a moment, just half a heartbeat, they were suspended like that in the air. At the apex of it all. Weightless. Invincible. And then 𝗂𝗏𝗏 turned his nose to the ocean and dived. They dropped like a stone. Izuku couldn't even scream. His eyes were streaming. The thrill sent his stomach soaring into his mouth as they plummeted down through the endless blue. They were the fastest things in the world. They were the kings of the sky. As quickly as he'd closed them, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 flattened his wings open like a parachute and they bumped to a halt 20 meters above the roiling ocean. Izuku clutched his neck, babbling, 𝗧𝗵𝗃, that was amazing, amazing, you're amazing. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 plunged them into the ocean. A slap of water, a shock of cold, and Izuku was blinking in the sunshine again, soaking wet. He laughed, loud and full. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 did it again. And again, until Izuku's eyes were stinging and his nose was burning from the salt, until the sea and the sky were one mass of churning blue, and he couldn't tell up from down or one breath from the next. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 spun them like top, tumbling them over and over, Izuku's heartbeat rabbiting along to the rhythm. His whoops of delight and 𝗧𝗵𝗃's satisfied roars were lost to the rush and churn of the freezing wind. Izuku was laughing so hard his stomach was beginning to cramp. The hairpin turns around the sea stacks, pivoting through caves carved right into the side of tiny nearby islands. Izuku lost track of how long 𝗧𝗵𝗃 tumbled them through all the world's secret places at breakneck speeds. His head was spinning, his stomach buoyant, blood tingling, lightning lashing through his veins. Until it wasn't. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 stopped them, midair. In front of him, the sun was quietly setting. Behind him, 𝗧𝗵𝗃's spiny tail fanned out like a flag. They were floating so softly through the air that they might not have been flying at all. 𝗧𝗵𝗃, Izuku whispered, inside still whirring from the roller coaster ride. 𝗧𝗵𝗃, what's going on? 𝗧𝗵𝗃 huffed, flicked the tips of his wings, sent Izuku a look over his shoulder that seemed to say, doesn't matter, shitty Deku. Just enjoy it. So Izuku did. Buttery yellow clouds, as tall as mountains, billowed on either side of them as 𝗧𝗵𝗃 caught an updrift and ascended, the ice crystals kissing over Izuku's skin and through his hair until they were surrounded by them. Izuku watched open-mouthed as the curtain parted and his world melted into muted pinks, burnished oranges, lovey, hazy golds. He brushed his hands through the robe of clouds above them, below them, feeling the whispering cold condense into droplets on his skin. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 veered them in a sweeping arc, and oh, it kept going and going, ruffled columns of white bigger than his whole island and blushing pink against the snatches of blue peeking out behind them. And then 𝗧𝗵𝗃 tilted them above the eye line of the setting sun, and here the world was dark and bright and blue, like the ocean they'd long since left behind, the cloud a king's carpet beneath them, dotted with little white piles and mounds and crags and wispy fingers that reached towards the stars like they were happy to see them. Above them, Izuku gasped soundlessly, feeling overwhelmed tears prickle at his eyes. Above them, sheets of color and light shimmered and danced and bled into each other in some ageless language, the aurora borealis, and oh, Izuku knew he'd never see anything like it again. He clutched 𝗧𝗵𝗃 like a lifeline, crying softly at the gossamer violet, the undulating bars of emerald, and then again at the blue and orange of splash of his village many miles below them, the mouths of the guardian gargoyles hewn into the rocks aglow with watchfires. They landed softly in a copse of trees in the slopes below the village. Izuku slid down 𝗧𝗵𝗃's side, feeling shaky and hollowed out and filled up, tears still leaking from his eyes. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 shifted, a ripple and a crunch, to stand beside him, hands awkwardly buried in the pockets of his tunic. 𝗧𝗵𝗃, that was, there were no words to convey that quiet, bursting wonder that had wrapped itself around Izuku's bones, so he didn't try. Instead, Izuku reached forward and buried his face in 𝗧𝗵𝗃's collar, trying to squeeze his thanks, into 𝗧𝗵𝗃's skin. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 smelled like smoky sweet fire and wind and the burlap of his tunic and swims in the lake and the cold breath of the clouds, and Izuku never wanted him to leave. But 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was still and unresponsive beneath him, so Izuku made himself draw away, still sniffling. Thank you, he opened his mouth to say, but found that he couldn't, so he tried to send it down the vow ribboning between them, and it must have worked because 𝗧𝗵𝗃 jolted into movement. Roughly, almost clumsily, which was a word Izuku had never before associated him with, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 stuck out a hand. Made you something, he said gruffly, eyes on his worn-through boots. Izuku peered into his palm and found, is that a bead? It was. Russet orange and roughly round, like it had been chipped from one of the river rocks and meticulously shaped with the point of a dagger. Kaken's shoulders stiffened. Yeah. For that, Harry, and when Izuku did nothing but gape at him, but if you don't want it, no. Izuku snatched it out of Kaken's hand and clenched it so tightly he felt the rough edges bite into his skin. I want it. Thank you. Thank you. Kaken looked at him for a moment, skin nearly glowing in the dark. You gonna put it in your hair? Hands trembling, Izuku quickly separated a piece of hair from beside the other stiff little braids under his ear and slid the bead to its base. Moonlight, white as sea foam, bathed their grassy little knoll and all its velvety bumps and hollows as Izuku wove his hair into an uneven braid with fumbling, shaking fingers. Kaken watched as Izuku tied the plait off with a hanging seam ripped from the collar of his tunic and smoothed his hair back over it, listening to the bead clink against its brothers and sisters in greeting. He cleared his throat. Thank you, Kaken. You said that already. Izuku swallowed. Laughed nervously. Yeah, I guess I did. Listen, Kaken, they both stopped. You go first, Izuku offered, his cheeks hot. Kaken nodded shortly. Right? Kaken's face was tight. I'm probably never gonna see you again, and oh, the vow didn't like that, shrieking painfully in Izuku's. Or maybe that was just him and his stupid heart. But I dunno. This hasn't been so bad. The words looked like they'd stuck in Kaken's throat on the way up. Like they'd been extremely difficult to say. Ah, thank you, Izuku began, before Kaken interrupted. You're still tiny and green and annoying and if in pain in my butt though. But you're alright to talk to, I guess. From him, that might as well have been Kaken making them a set of friendship bracelets, or gluing them together by the hip. Izuku's face was so hot he was pretty sure it was steaming. Kaken was glaring intently at the weeds. His eyes flickered upwards, quickly, and then back down. Don't, he cleared his throat, don't get eaten or whatever. Izuku's bottom lip trembled. I'm going to miss you a lot, Kaken, he said thickly, like, a lot. Kaken cleared his throat again. Course you will. I'm effin' amazing, aren't I? Izuku laughed wetly. Yeah, Kaken's amazing. Silence. And the dull thrum of the night insects. Then Katsuki. Izuku blinked away hot tears. My name's Katsuki. 𝗬𝗓𝗵𝗃𝗲. A layer of power rippled through the shaggy grass. Kaken, Katsuki, was hunching forward, hands stuffed even deeper into his pockets. Izuku's mouth popped open, then closed, then open, until he could finally choke out, 𝗧𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗲. Not Deku. That's my name. Izuku. Hearing his name in that dear, familiar voice was almost too much, and not nearly enough. Izuku made himself wet his lips, made himself say, Katsuki, and watched Katsuki's red eyes widen from inches away. Felt the bond swell and shimmer between them, like the aurora borealis they'd been drowning in minutes before. Something shattered down in the village, and the spell was broken. Izuku leapt back, flushing, heart beating so loudly in his ears that surely Katsuki could hear it too. Katsuki swallowed. It's late? Yeah. I gotta leave now. But. Izuku lifted his arms, half a thought about another hug appearing and dissolving as quickly as it had come, and dropped them. Good luck. Or fly straight. I'm not sure what you'd usually, I could say, may the winds favor you, which would work technically, but it's meant for sailing mostly, but your wings are sort of like sails, I guess. I don't really know what I'm saying, actually. At all. Please stop me. A ghost of a smile had warmed the planes of Katsuki's face by the time Izuku in a breath. Weirdo. Bully. Fuckhead. Lizard. They grinned at each other for a moment, and then Katsuki extracted a hand from his pocket to ruffle Izuku's hair. Bye, loser. And he shifted with a crack, crunching the heather beneath his huge feet. 2 beats of his wings and Katsuki was in the sky. Izuku strained after him until he couldn't anymore, until the clouds closed and the wind picked up and washed Katsuki's sweet smoky scent away, and Izuku's heart sort of felt like it was breaking, just a little. The bead rustled in his hair. 2 weeks before exile for the last 8 months of his life, Izuku had woken up dreaming of Katsuki. Actually, that wasn't quite true. He didn't dream of Katsuki specifically, but instead a strung-together collage of unfamiliar sights and sounds that Izuku couldn't attribute to any of his own memories. A lavender sky washing light over an ocean. A flock of gulls flying a hand's breadth away. A pool of some weird, viscous glowy orangey stuff that looked like liquid fire, burbling lazily in the maw of a cave. Izuku just knew they were Kaken. Maybe his memories, maybe glimpses of the world through his eyes. Izuku had plenty of theories, each more outlandish than the next. But definitely something not regular and possibly worrisome. If Izuku could bring himself to have any reaction to the Katsuki dreams other than missing him. Gods, he missed him. Horribly and always. A low-level wail echoing in his breastbone, right where the edge of the vow dissolved. He'd thought it would fade over the months, as spring warmed into summer and Izuku's freckles multiplied like rabbits, but instead it had sharpened and twisted and niggled away until every second thought Izuku had was poisoned. He was sort of embarrassed about it, honestly. The first best friend he ever made, and Izuku had to go and imprint on him or something like a baby duckling. He was sure Katsuki would laugh himself hoarse if he ever found out Izuku would periodically return to their basin in the middle of the woods just because, or that he had a habit of fingering the rough, orange little bead buried in his hair, or that he'd started eating spicy peppers even though they made his nose red and his eyes water, because they reminded him of Katsuki's cooking. Izuku burned with shame just thinking about it. So, Izuku kept himself distracted. Very distracted. He'd spent more time with Aizawa in the last 8 months than he had his entire life, and it had been nice, peaceful, working at the forge in companyable silence punctuated by the occasional quiet conversation. He'd also become Grandma Chiyo's official unofficial herb gatherer, which was something he never would have guessed he'd enjoy as much as he did. He could almost hear Kaken's scathing, green eyes, green head, green thumbs, "You sure you're not turning into a tree Deku?" every time he set off to forage. Training was good too. Izuku was still hopeless with a sword, and a bludgeon, and an axe, and basically everything else, but hand-to-hand was a different story. There, Izuku's size was suddenly an advantage, his speed coveted, and the unexpected power behind his punches and kicks, but especially his kicks, meant he was never short of partners. He also spent a lot of time, buckets and buckets of it, actually, dragon watching in secret. Not any one species in particular, and certainly not any of the big ones that slalomed through the sky during battles, but chittering forest dwellers that traveled in packs, or tiny nanodragons building termite-like structures in the dirt. Sometimes Izuku would climb up a tree, wait until the woods settled around him and the birds had begun chirping again, and spend all day watching dragons scuttle over the undergrowth or wheel in the sky. It was unnerving as much as it was comforting to know that they had a human form lurking beneath scaly skin, but Izuku still had so many questions about that. Why weren't they wandering around on 2 legs at least some of the time? Was it an ability only very powerful dragons could control? None of them seemed to understand Izuku when he tried to talk to them, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Curious and curiouser. And the most curious thing of all, Grandma Chiyo had insisted that Izuku learn to read. As a rule, Vikings did not read. Of course, they knew enough to recognize names on a map or a battle plan, but that was just about it. Books were considered a horrible, civilizing influence, and had been banned by order of the Thing, the annual meeting of all the Viking chieftains, generations ago. No books, no words, no need to read. Izuku had tried to explain that to Grandma Chiyo, but she'd threatened to curse lice into his hair forever. Izuku didn't try again. Within a couple of months, Izuku could read the long, complicated books Grandma Chiyo assigned to him as easily as any Roman scholar. He had no idea where she was procuring them, but he didn't want lice, even though he'd never heard of a real-life actual person successfully cursing anything before. He'd experienced too much magic in the last year to risk it. Writing, however, was a whole other matter. It was so frustrating. Izuku could picture the letters in his mind perfectly, and imagine them emerging from his pen, neat and quick. But when his brain tried to tell his hand what to do, it responded with a clumsily, fumbling sort of motion that just looked like a blot of ink, or, if he was lucky, a squiggly line. He still did his best though, steadily chewing through notebook Grandma Chiyo had given him. Thor only knows where she'd found that. Honestly, he suspected she was going quite senile, and then another and another once he'd filled the first. It was how he kept himself occupied, especially during the dragon attacks which Izuku now point-blank refused to participate in, even on the rare nights one of the warriors Izuku's age offered to sneak him out onto the battlefield. The idea that this war, this senseless war, was not being fought between Vikings and brutes but instead between two species of intelligent, rational, conscious beings, it made him sick. He didn't want to see the carnage, the burns, the wounds, on his people or Katsuki's, and he wasn't big enough or important enough to try and stop it. The single instance he had brought it up with All Might at the dinner table, months ago now, All Might had laughed so hard stew had come out of his nose. Son, he'd beamed, that's not the way things work in our world. It's survival of the fittest. Only pretty princesses and weaklings shy away from the glory of battle. We are Vikings. We laugh in the face of death, we spit in the eye of the great typhoon. You'll get it one day, and then All Might had gone back to the important task of shoveling food into his mouth. Izuku hadn't asked again. Sometimes, watching from the forge window during the raids, Izuku swore he caught a glimpse of Katsuki's dragon form, the tip of a wing, the spiny shadow of a tail, but whenever he double-checked there was nothing. He didn't know whether or not he was thankful for it. Night of Exile, the thud of burning rocks hitting the ocean echoed around the island and rocked the wooden docks, but Izuku didn't even flinch. The raid had been going on for over an hour. This wasn't the first catapult round to be launched, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Izuku had spent all afternoon disabling the snares the Vikings had strung up around the orchards to snatch at low-flying dragons, but he couldn't make himself cripple the catapults, even though it wouldn't have taken any more than one well-placed slice of his dagger. It would be dooming at least half of the warriors to death by flames or teeth. The catapults deterred the dragons, stopped a lot of them from flying in too close. Izuku rested his head against the windowsill, letting the wooden grain press lines into his forehead. Behind him, Aizawa hammered away at a sheet of metal. He knew better than to demand Izuku go over and help him. Until the raid was over, Izuku would watch from the window as all the tiny figures below ran in circles and bellowed, and the tiny figures in the sky wheeled in circles and spat plumes of orange. Suddenly, a streak of lilac, a dragon slightly longer and leaner than the rest with a drifting crown of spikes bristling from its head, tore through the mass of flying beasts and dived for the village below. Izuku sat a little straighter. The Vikings released another volley of catapults, but the dragon didn't look like it cared, even as one clipped the edge of its jagged wing. It opened its mouth and roared, and oh, that sounded furious. Below, far below, by the harbor, Izuku saw All Might swivel his head, brandish his sword, and begin lumbering up after it. And then something else moved too, bolting after the purple dragon so fast it looked like it was falling from the sky. Izuku's heart stopped beating. His breath froze in his lungs. He knew that shape, those barbed wings, those orange-tipped spines. And this time, when he double-checked, the dragon was still there, fleeing into his village with fire on his teeth and talons outstretched. Kaken. Izuku moved. Before Aizawa had even looked up from his work, Izuku was out the door and sprinting towards the village as fast as he possibly could. The purple dragon had landed on the roof of the great hall and was ripping beams out with its teeth, spewing fire into the air. Izuku caught a glimpse of Katsuki joining it, and then he tripped over a loose stone and smacked his chin into the ground. The pain didn't even register. Izuku just hauled himself up and kept on running. By the time he made it to the center of the village, the roof had caved in and Izuku could hear roaring and spitting and snarling from inside the great hall. He all but fell through the doors. The dragons, twisted into a knot of limbs and wings, froze at the sight of him. Kaken. Izuku, hands on his knees. Kaken, wait, what are you? Why? All Might burst in behind him, sword in one hand, axe in the other, breastplate heaving and eyes alight with the thrill of the battle. Izuku's stomach went cold. Oh no. No. With a sudden flurry of movement, Katsuki gripped the purple dragon by the scruff of its neck and tossed it clear out a window with an ear-splitting shatter. Squawking and sputtering, the dragon tried to claw its way back through the broken glass, but Katsuki roared loudly, and it stilled. With a bow of its scaly head, the purple dragon took off into the night. All Might started forward. Automatically, Izuku's arm leapt up to barricade the way. All Might looked down at him, the torches in their brackets casting flickering shadows across his face. "Father, please, you don't understand what you're doing." All Might swept him out of the way. Izuku reached for him again. Father, listen to me. Izuku." All Might wasn't even looking at him. His gaze was steady on Katsuki, who was already crouching low and panther-like, hackles raised. Before Izuku could say anything else, All Might flashed forward, sword high. Katsuki leapt back just as fast. All Might followed him, and soon they were a blur of sword on talons, scales on chainmail, ignoring Izuku's frantic cries of "Stop! Stop! Please stop!" The teeth of All Might's sword bit at Katsuki's neck. Katsuki caught it with his mouth, maw bleeding, and held a threatening claw to the weak spot in the joint of All Might's armor. They stayed locked like that. A stalemate. Some part of Izuku knew that Katsuki could have torched them both to ash the moment he'd seen them, the same part of him that watched his talon hover there, never once twitching forwards. Izuku, All Might bearing down on "Get an axe. A knife, something. Stab this beast through the gut while I have him cornered." Izuku made a split-second decision. Somewhere, too close for comfort but too far away to matter, the moon lifted her great, appealing head in interest. "Look," she whispered to the sea, "look, something's happening." "I know," the sea whispered back, "you're a little slow on the uptake." Back on Berk, Izuku grabbed a sword from a nearby rack, hands cold. The sound of his footsteps echoed round and round the rows of shields, the candle holders, the disembodied heads of dragons that watched, still and silent where they were mounted on the walls. He was close enough now to see the sweat beading on All Might's forehead, the unique way Katsuki's scales gobbled the light around them, shifting over powerful muscles. Izuku raised the sword, and angled it at his father's throat. All Might staggered back, the talon against his stomach now lax and soft. "Izuku," he gasped. Izuku ignored him. "Kaken," he pleaded, green eyes meeting red, "you have to get out of here. Please go." Katsuki visible hesitated, spines bristling, but Izuku shook his head. "Go." Katsuki slunk out the hole in the roof. When Izuku dragged his eyes away, All Might's face was hard. Izuku bowed his head. He knew what he'd done. What it meant. All Might didn't say a word to him as they left the hall. Outside, the battle had calmed and a few, straggling soldiers were still making their way up the beach, but for the most part, everybody had gathered outside the great hall and stood before the two of them now, shrouded in darkness save for the flickering lights of their torches. "Elders of the tribe," All Might said, and his voice was very, very grave, "please follow me." A few people broke off from the crowd. 𝗵𝗃 𝗪𝐺, the vicious twins. Others Izuku couldn't make out because his eyes were beginning to blur. All Might led them inside and shut the heavy doors behind them. Izuku stood alone in the grass. Distantly, he could feel himself shaking. Aizawa appeared behind him and fastened a sturdy hand over his shoulder. Izuku looked up in surprise, but Aizawa's face was impassive. He squeezed Izuku's shoulder, though, and drew him almost comfortingly into his side. Izuku leaned back immediately, feeling like one strong breeze could knock him over. Below them, the crowd was murmuring, probably trying to figure out what was going on. The sound washed over Izuku in susurrus waves. He kept seeing Katsuki, that talon, the blood dripping over his teeth. Finally, after what felt like hours, the elders returned. 𝗵𝗃 looked angrier than Izuku had ever seen her, and she immediately shuffled over to stand next to him. He didn't acknowledge her. He couldn't. He knew he'd start crying. All Might cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Hooligans. Tonight we find ourselves in a very unfortunate situation." Izuku wanted to laugh. All Might made it sound like he'd tripped and fallen into treason. "Izuku Midoriya," All Might paused to let all the Vikings' heads swivel towards him. Izuku shrunk into Aizawa. My son, is on trial for betrayal of the Viking code. He has raised his sword in defense of a dragon, and against his own kind." The crowd gasped. Aizawa's hand tightened on his shoulder, but he didn't let go. "I have described the full event to the elders, and we have decided, as is the custom, to give Izuku a chance to explain himself and soften the blow of his punishment." Hundreds of expectant eyes locked on his. All Mights were very blue. Izuku. Speak. Izuku. Izuku saw his future stretch out into two prongs before him. Right here, right now, he could break the vow he'd made with Katsuki and reveal that dragons had the ability to turn into humans. There would be uproar, outrage, and probably a demand for proof. Proof would look like capturing a dragon and torturing it until it revealed its human form. It would not stop the war. Izuku had seen enough of the cruelty of man to know that it would only make the Vikings angrier, more bloodthirsty, to know that their enemy had a mind, had the ability to plan and strategize and calculate and hate just as they did. But it would save Izuku's life. And Izuku knew he'd never do it. Silently, he shook his head. For a moment, Izuku believed All Might would protest, or demand an explanation, or defend him against the now clamoring crowd. He thought back to the moments they'd had together, All Might giving him his first sword, taking Izuku out to catch his first fish, telling him long, awesome tales about heroes and warriors, and promising that Izuku would be just like them someday. But All Might only took a deep breath, face crumpled with sadness, and said, "We cannot ignore our law. As a last act of mercy, I will allow Izuku one more night of shelter under my roof, but first thing tomorrow morning he will be set ashore on the mainland to fend for himself." The still-burning fires from the battle kicked and crackled around them. "Pity me," All Might said heavily, "for this is the saddest thing I have ever had to do, to banish my own son." The crowd murmured unhappily, applauding the nobility of their chief. Izuku couldn't even bring himself to be angry. He knew his father was a good man, a kind man, but before he had a duty to Izuku, he had a duty to his people. People Izuku had been around all his life, people who he'd laughed with and eaten with and fought with, and people who turned their faces away as All Might's guards led him from Aizawa and Grand Machio to a dungeon beneath the great hall that Izuku hadn't even known they had. One of them locked him in with a set of jangling keys. Another handed him a water skin, a small kindness, and Izuku tried to smile his thanks. But then he was alone, with nothing but the plip, plip, plip of some leak in the roof, and a rat Izuku was pretty sure he'd seen scuttling around in a corner. He sat back against the wall. Nothing was registering, not the situation, not the grief, not the heartbreaking look of sadness on All Might's face, let alone the idea of his exile tomorrow. His mother, gods, how would she react? Izuku hoped the other ladies of the tribe would support her, hoped that he'd get to say goodbye to her. Or hoped that he wouldn't, both would be equally horrible. But he'd worry about that when the sun came up. Feeling achy and overwhelmed, he leant his head back on the damp, mildewy bricks and closed his eyes. Some indefinite amount of time later, Izuku woke to a strange noise. A hollow hissing popping noise. He blinked in the darkness, and then when that didn't work, rubbed at his eyes. It seemed to be coming from the door. The door, whose edges were glowing. Izuku scrambled to his feet. No, not glowing, melting. In less than a minute, heavy orange iron was oozing over the floor. Izuku's heart beat a frantic tattoo in his throat. It couldn't be, could it? Another minute, and the whole door had dripped into iron ore. Izuku squinted through the smoke and haze of light, and there he was. A black shape that collapsed into a gorgeously familiar silhouette in the doorway, narrow waist, corded arms, halo of spiky hair that was perhaps a little longer than it had been last time Izuku saw him, screaming die at the top of his lungs. Katsuki. Izuku couldn't help it. He burst into tears. F***, already with the waterworks, shitty Deku. Don't you ever get dehydrated or something? Izuku shook his head in disbelief as Katsuki gingerly made his way around the puddles of still glowing or blood leaking from the twin wounds in the corners of his mouth where All Might's sword had pressed, but still scowling furiously. It was the sight of that scowl that helped Izuku find his voice. Kaken, I can't believe you're here, oh my goodness, I can't believe you're here. Get out. They're going to find you, they're going to kill you. Quit the yapping, Katsuki snapped, reaching through the bars to yank Izuku against them by the collar of his tunic. I'm getting you out of here, you got that? Ain't nobody dying tonight. It's like you don't even know me. The vow was positively singing in Izuku's, twirling over and over itself in delighted cartwheels and crooning at the feel of Katsuki's warmth so close, so real. Izuku wiped his face, an exercise in futility, smearing snot everywhere. Katsuki smirked meanly, and oh, Izuku had missed him so much. Mucus. Izuku half laughed, half sobbed into the sleeve of his tunic. Why, you're horrible. And you're a goddamn mess. Now PSS off into a corner so I can bust you out. Izuku hiccuped, swallowed, and made himself say, but then what? There's nowhere I can go. Katsuki looked at him carefully. You can live with me. Izuku's mouth popped open. Kaken. I can't ask that of you. And besides, you won't be allowed. I do what I want. As touching as this is, an amused voice floated from the doorway. I don't think it would be wise to deliver Izuku into the heart of dragon territory. Yet anyway. Izuku, his head up. There, making her way down the stone corridor, was 𝗵𝗄𝗃. Aizawa trailed behind her, eyeing the melted door with the resignation of someone who knew it was their job to fix it. Katsuki immediately stiffened. Which, he hissed, and his grip tightened on Izuku's collar. Izuku looked between them as. 𝗵𝗄𝗃 smiled beatifically. What do you mean which? That's 𝗵𝗄𝗃. Katsuki whirled toward him. What you mean grandma? Oh, none of that, 𝗵𝗄𝗃 tooted. We've all got a common goal here, don't we? Do we? Katsuki growled. I dunno what you're here to do, lady, but you ain't getting near Deku. His eyes flickered to Aizawa. And who the F is that? That's Aizawa. 𝗵𝗄𝗃 replied cheerfully. She looked entirely too happy about the whole situation, actually. Izuku felt 15 steps behind. He was still stuck on which, and the fact that Katsuki was here, in the flesh, which felt like continually injecting the vow between them with thousands of tiny flakes of gold. It was an extremely distracting sensation, and it made it difficult for him to make sense of how and why there were currently people standing around arguing in his prison cell. What was everyone here to do, exactly? Well, I'm here to free you. Katsuki jutted his chin at 𝗵𝗄𝗃 and Aizawa. I dunno about that freak show. You want me to toast them? Izuku squeaked. No toasting, please. Awfully touchy, aren't you? 𝗵𝗄𝗃 scolded, shuffling around the puddles. We're here to free Izuku too. Don't get your tail in a twist. Izuku perked up at that. Really? Father reversed my exile. Well, no. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the line for you, not at all. I f***ing hate witches, Katsuki groused, always speaking in riddles. The F does that mean not the end of the line? Can you save this idiot or not? He'll save himself, 𝗵𝗄𝗃 replied, appearing not at all fazed by Katsuki's rudeness. Katsuki, seemingly fed up, turned to Aizawa. He barked, explain. Right now. Aizawa blinked slowly at him and then slid his gaze to 𝗵𝗄𝗃. Is he talking to me? Izuku gaped at her. That meant. Oh F in hell, you speak Dragonese too, you ancient goddamn raisin. Kaken. Izuku gasped, but 𝗵𝗄𝗃 only chuckled. Yes. My accent needs a lot of work, as you can probably tell, but no, she interrupted, just as Katsuki opened his mouth. I didn't teach Izuku. He acquired that particular skill all on his own. Katsuki took a minute, visibly struggling, before he relented with a harsh bark of whatever. Use your creepy witchy magic to get him out of here then, see if I care, and slunk away to stand in a corner. Izuku curled against the far wall, really not looking forward to being on the receiving end of any creepy witchy magic. 𝗵𝗄𝗃 raised a gnarled finger. Katsuki stiffened in his corner. Izuku winced back. Aizawa, 𝗵𝗄𝗃 said happily, and Izuku understood her perfectly, but it felt different in his ears. Fetch the keys, will you? There's a deer. Aizawa fished a jangling set of keys out of his pocket, keys Izuku recognized from the hand of the guard who'd locked him away. Aizawa caught him looking and shot him a wry grin. Don't forget, I was the one All Might used to send on stealth missions. Katsuki spluttered. The F. Who is this sad sack of death anyway? Some kind of leader around here. Aizawa's eyes flickered briefly over to him, and then back to Izuku as he cranked the key in its lock. Do all dragons have an attitude like a garbage fire, or is it just this one? Izuku only giggled as the cell door swung open. Immediately, Aizawa wrenched him into a tight hug. Katsuki growled from somewhere over Izuku's shoulder. "There's a boat with supplies ready for you by the docks," he murmured, and gratitude nearly reduced Izuku to tears again. Aizawa pulled back and thumbed the twisted metal bead in Izuku's hair, the one that he'd given him. "Don't die." Izuku choked out a miserable laugh, because that was what Aizawa had always said when Izuku rushed off into the night, and it had just occurred to him that he would probably never hear it again. Aizawa ruffled his hair fondly, and stepped back to let 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐿 bustle through. "Now," she said promptly, grabbing his wrists and immediately winding strings of 𝗬𝗪𝙢 beads and bird feathers and charms around them, "you will need to work quickly before this war brutalizes the lot of us. You have about a year, give or take, but I'd much prefer if you were done yesterday, so you really must hurry it up. Gather the king's lost things, all of them mind, and then meet me on the Isle of Tomorrow. All clear." Izuku blinked. "Thor preserve me from the terminally stupid," 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐿 muttered, casting her eyes up as she hooked a series of necklaces around Izuku's neck, bones, beads, a lone lobster claw, the king's things, his missing objects, his scattered collection of mystical paraphernalia, his hodgepodge of extremely inconvenient doohickeys. "I really don't know how much clearer I can be." Izuku gaped at her. "The king's lost things, isn't that a children's tale?" "I assure you it is not," she said seriously. "Find them, end the war, become the heroes of the archipelago. Oh, and be accepted back into the tribe," she added, as if something like that was an afterthought. Izuku could barely keep up, mouth open, making a series of unintelligible noises as 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐿 finished decorating him and shoved him bodily towards the dimly lit corridor. "Quickly! And take your rude little friend with you." Izuku shook his head to clear it. Whatever that was, he'd figure it out once they were out of sight of Hooligan Harbor. He turned to Katsuki, unexpectedly nervous. "Are you, coming?" Katsuki looked like Izuku had just asked him if he wanted to go diving in his underwear. "Are you stupid? Course I'm coming. You won't last an hour out there." Izuku felt his bottom lip catch on his teeth as he grinned and grinned and grinned, because despite everything, despite the horrible situation and 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐿's cryptic demands that he would have to dissect later and the slow-moving ache in his 𝗧𝗔 at the thought of leaving the only life he'd ever known behind, at least he had Kaken back. Katsuki stared at him, wide-eyed, a pink flush rising to his cheeks, until 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐿 clicked her fingers impatiently, and they both snapped out of it. Izuku gave her and Aizawa one last crushing hug each as quickly as he could. "Quit dragging your feet or I'll f***ing murder you myself, Deku," and then he clutched Katsuki's wrist and sprinted down towards the docks where, as promised, a little boat was bobbing in wait. Izuku checked the name on the side before they got in. The Hopeful Puffin. He looked at Katsuki and smiled. Katsuki was surprisingly quiet as they unmoored the boat and let it follow the flow of the current out of Hooligan Harbor, past the gulf Izuku usually swam across and into the calm, quiet waters that sat between Berk and the peaceable country. Izuku fidgeted nervously with the hem of his tunic. "Kaken, are you okay?" Katsuki had found the oars at the bottom of the boat and was turning one over and over in his hands. The corners of his mouth were still bleeding. Izuku was just about to ask again when Katsuki gripped the and glared at him. "Why'd you do that?" "Do what?" Katsuki glared at him harder. "You know what?" Izuku twisted his fingers together. "They were really talking about it, weren't they?" "Yeah, we effing are." Izuku tentatively reached for the bond between them and found it curled protectively against Katsuki, like he'd gathered it in a fist. "What was I supposed to do? All Might was going to kill you. I could have taken him, but you didn't," Izuku said pleadingly, because why did he need an excuse to protect Katsuki after all this time? Weren't they friends? He didn't understand. "You didn't, and you weren't going to, and I couldn't." Izuku didn't know what he couldn't do. Katsuki's teeth were bared. "I don't need protection, Deku. Especially not from a weakling like you." And oh, that stung enough that Izuku returned it with a jab of his own. "Well, what were you even doing attacking Berk anyway?" "I thought you wouldn't because I lived there, because I'm not sure anymore. I mean, I haven't joined the raid since, you know." Katsuki's lip curled. You're an idiot? Izuku felt his cheeks sting and he hurried to the front of the boat, feelings thick and clouded in his missing Katsuki, not missing him, anger, confusion, and bone-deep exhaustion that drooped his eyelids. Izuku wanted to sleep for a decade. Deku. Izuku stopped. Turned. Katsuki didn't look at him, but the vow unfurled outwards slightly, warmer at the edges. I haven't been back to your shitty island. I wasn't there tonight to attack, or whatever. Something inside Izuku uncoiled. What were you doing there, then? Who was that other dragon? Katsuki sighed heavily. F***ing Shinso. Purple pain in my goddamn butt. One of the shitty traps on your island injured his paramour, who shouldn't have been F***ing sniffing around this side of the archipelago. Effer lost his HT, said he was gonna burn your village to the ground. So you followed him? To stop him, Katsuki emphasized, looking almost nervous. I didn't mean I didn't even know I was gonna see you. Izuku took a moment to process that. What's a paramour? To his surprise, Katsuki flushed pink. Partner. If what you call it, husband. That Izuku felt his cheeks heat too. That makes sense. Sorry. I didn't know. Is Shinsu's his heir, 𝗧𝗵𝗲? Katsuki released a breath. Yeah. He didn't elaborate. Izuku shifted nervously, and the boat rocked under them in response. Katsuki was the first to talk. I don't say sorry. I know. But effin', thank you, or whatever. I didn't want to kill that blue-eyed freak. Your dad. Katsuki swept his gaze over Izuku, lingering on his eyes and hair. You don't look like him at all. People say I look like my mum. Me too. Stupid old hag. Izuku let out a startled laugh. Kakin? You can't call your mother that. Katsuki grinned lazily at him, the line of his body relaxing into the wooden bench. I can do whatever I want. Still. That's so rude. You wouldn't say that if you'd met her. She's f***ing insufferable. Worse than me. Izuku shuddered involuntarily, and Katsuki snickered at him. The air between them settled, and Izuku found himself wanting to slot himself next to Katsuki and demand he tell him everything that had happened since they'd last seen each other. There was also the small matter of the king's lost things, the most widely known and fantastical of all the Vikings' bedtime stories, which apparently had something to do with reversing Izuku's banishment and ending the Dragon War, if 𝗵𝗃 was to be believed. 𝗵𝗃 the witch, according to Katsuki. Katsuki, whose mouth was still bleeding, would you quit that? Izuku startled and turned to look at Katsuki, who had his head in his hands. You ever stop thinking, Deku? How hasn't this useless garbage fallen out of your goddamn ears already? You need to clean your brain with a f***ing toothbrush, I swear to God. Izuku stared at him. How did you what? Katsuki sneered at him. You're yelling all that HT at the top of your f***ing lungs? Izuku touched his mouth. I am. No, not like that. Did you not know? Know what? Katsuki groaned again. I hate my life. Do you even know what a binding vow is, nerd? Or did you just stick your hand into the void and hope for the best? Izuku's neck went hot with embarrassment. Sorta, I guess. Aren't they just promises that you're not supposed to break? Katsuki stared at him incredulously. Promises you're not supposed to for F's sake. It's a binding vow, you idiot. It bound us. We have a bond. And then he seemed to realize what he'd said and shut his mouth, eyebrows low. Izuku's neck burned even hotter. A bond? Yes, a bond, Katsuki snapped, not looking at him, and you scream every second f***ing thought down it and into my goddamn skull. I thought you were doing it to be annoying at first, but turns out you're just an idiot. Should have known. Izuku wanted to melt into the deck with embarrassment. Did that mean Katsuki knew how much he had been thinking about him in the 8 months they were apart? Or how stupidly happy he felt when they were together? Oh gods, he was totally going to throw up. Katsuki didn't seem to be weirded out or anything, and he wasn't sneering at Izuku with disgust, or at least, not any more than usual. Maybe he didn't know. Even now, he wasn't recoiling away and diving into the ocean as Izuku's mind frantically flicked through every thought he'd ever had in the last year. Izuku rubbed his nose and coughed. That's great. So great, super duper great, well now you know how do I turn it off? He tried to mentally clamp or squish his brain somehow, imagining it decompressing into a little fleshy cube hidden from 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's quick eyes. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's face twisted briefly. Not like that, stupid. Ow, that's my foot, fuckhead. No, just. He grabbed Izuku's shoulders and aggressively positioned him on the opposite bench, facing each other, and yanked Izuku's left hand forwards. Izuku opened it, unprompted. There, right in the cup of his palm, a long, thin scar winked up at them, slightly raised and silvery. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 revealed his own. A matching set. Focus, he told Izuku, and look properly. Don't half-butt it. Izuku squinted hard, really, really hard, and tried to look with everything inside of him, not just his eyes, at the space between their palms. There, shimmering into existence, was the bond. Izuku knew it the moment he saw it. It took up so much space but none at all at the same time. A golden string. A gap in the universe. Or, more like a fold, that made 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's hand into his and his into 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's. Looking at it directly sort of made him feel sick. I don't like it. Told you it's old magic. Shouldn't be playing around with that stuff. Then why did you say yes? The bond tightened briefly, like a black hole collapsing. Izuku saw spots behind his eyes until 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 said tightly, "Aren't you the one that keeps telling me it was the goddamn mead? Make up your mind, stupid Deku," and wrenched his hand away. The weird gold string swirl of empty infinite space vanished, and Izuku's stomach stopped trying to turn itself inside out. Alright. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 kissed his teeth. Whatever. So don't throw your SHT in there, got it. I don't want to know what color your goddamn underwear is. Izuku did kind of get it. When he narrowed his attention down to the point where his neck met the back of his head, or the shortest distance between his and 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's bodies, he felt the bond writhing there, like a living weather formation that fed on the edges of them. Izuku had been lobbing his thoughts straight into the center of it. Gently, carefully, he pulled back from the eye and eased himself onto the back end of the golden string. He watched it waver where it dipped into that infinite space, and then glow again as it emerged on the other side and disappeared into 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's palm. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 cleared his throat. Yeah, like that. He scrubbed his hand across his mouth and assessed the red on his fingers critically. "This goddamn iron." Izuku his head as he made for the medical supplies Aizawa had left them in the hole. "Is iron bad for you or something?" 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 nodded jerkily. "Or something. Gets infected real quick and takes in ages to clot. It's annoying as hell." Izuku thought back to the way the wound on 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁's side months ago had almost rotted by the second day, and hurried to find Grandma Chiyo's cleaning liquid. Once 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 was disinfected and staunched with tiny pads of sticky moss and bandages Izuku had found in their supplies, 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 raised an eyebrow expectantly. "So, are you planning to tell me what that witch said to you while she turned you into a hat stand?" Izuku looked down at himself, still covered in dangling, jangling things, and sighed. "She's not a witch. Or if she is, she's really bad at magic." 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 gave him a long, hard look, said, "No, she's not," and took the lengths of jewelry Izuku unwound from his arms and tied them firmly to the mast of the boat. Izuku watched him do it, and then removed half his necklaces for 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 to wear. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 put them on without a word. The other half stayed firmly around Izuku's neck. He cleared his throat. "Just for the record, I have no idea what to make of this. It might not even be true. Actually, it's probably not true. Tell me anyway." "Okay. So, have you ever heard of the king's lost things?" 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 shook his head. "It's a children's story. Well, it's not really long enough to be a story, more like a lullaby. It's really, really popular. All the tribes know it. Well, I think they know it. I haven't exactly asked them, or taken a survey or anything." He breathed in, but 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐁 didn't interrupt him, his hip against the rim of the boat, arms crossed, eyes attentive. "It's about a series of object, 10 I think, that you'd recognize the king by. Oh, I should probably explain that, before the war, way before, the Vikings were sort of united under one king of the wilder west. So the legends say. No one really knows if it's true, or what it was like or anything, but rumors say there's ruins of a great city on the Isle of Tomorrow, which is an island way down south, but no one really goes there, 'cause it's haunted, maybe, I'm not too sure. Anyway, 𝗔𝗵𝗄𝗃 told me to find them and end the war. Which sounds ridiculous, I know, and I have no idea where I'd even start. Do you know what the things are? It was Izuku's turn to shake his head. Katsuki blew out a gust of air that ruffled his spiky bangs. Fine. Whatever, we'll look into it. Believe her? Izuku asked, surprised. Katsuki scowled. Tiny creepy village which tells you there's a chance you could end the war and you're not even a little curious. Yeah, right. Izuku frowned gently. Well, I suppose I am, so what's the biggie? Not like you've got anywhere else to be. Izuku pushed away the sudden bout of sharp sadness. No, I guess not. Katsuki grunted and uncrossed his arms. Let's hear that shitty lullaby then. Izuku racked his brain, drawing up his earliest memories around campfires with the other children his age, listening to bards twang away at their lyres. Okay, to be fair I don't know if it'll rhyme in Dragonese, but here goes. In forests wide and valleys deep, in darkened caves and mountains steep, a noble quest awaits the brave, the pure of heart, the unafraid. 10 lost things whose kingly lights draw heroes to their final heights. With swords ablaze they seek the trail, yet none return to tell the tale. He who finds them whence they lay is called a king on crowning day. So little ears come listen well, beware the curse, the jinx, the spell, but if 'tis you, the king shall be, seek the things and set us free. Katsuki was silent for a long moment. Izuku twisted his ankles together, untwisted them. Finally, Katsuki said, so it's a suicide mission? Izuku paused. Well, that wasn't a question, nerd. Izuku closed his mouth. The water lapped gently against the sides of their boat, a steady schlick-slosh-schlick that filled the night air with the smell of salt and storm. Then, Katsuki heaved a sigh and slapped his knees. I effing hate witches. Right. Here's what we're gonna do. If these shitty things do exist, there's gotta be some sort of record of them somewhere, in the history books or whatever. Yes, but Kaken, so we research, get ourselves a goddamn checklist, and wring the answers out of the demon idiots who wrote the stupid thing, but we can't. We figure out if it's legit, and if it is we'll find these pieces of Syrian like a week, 'cause I'm the in greatest obviously, and if you keep your head out of your butt long enough that in brain may even be helpful for once. Wait, Kaken? Got a couple of favors I could cash in if we've got to in hell. What? There aren't any records, Izuku burst out. Vikings don't keep them. Katsuki squinted. Then what the is in your history books? Books are banned actually. Katsuki raised his eyes. You gotta be kidding me, every time I think you Vikings can't get any dumber you actually go and do. It's uncanny. Izuku grimaced. Yeah, sorry. Katsuki raked his hands through his hair. Izuku thought he saw something flash just briefly in the sprawl of blonde, but then Katsuki was asking, so what, they burnt it all? Or did they never write anything in the first place? Neither actually. It's all locked away in the Meathead Public Library. Katsuki glared at him for a moment, then rubbed at his temples in frustrated disbelief. A locked public library. Am I hearing that right? It sort of is kind of an oxymoron, I guess. You're the moron. We're breaking in. Izuku yelped. No, we're not. It's guarded Kaken. Like really, really well guarded. Not to mention it's a total labyrinth inside, no one ever finds their way out. And the librarian, what if she catches us? I'm not afraid of some wrinkly crone, If Deku. She's a flashmaster, Katsuki. Even All Might isn't a flashmaster. Flashmasters were the lucky few who managed to graduate from Flashburn's school of sword fighting, and their swordsmanship was the stuff of legends. Izuku had told Katsuki everything he knew about it one slow day in their basin as they hid from the rain. Katsuki paused. We'll make sure she doesn't find us. How on earth are we going to do that? Katsuki set his mouth in a grim line. I know a girl. Unfortunately.